Somewhere under the soil of Britain, there is an answer to a question that no one alive knows how to ask correctly. The island has been lived on for far longer than memory, far longer than writing, far longer than any story that has survived to be told. People walked these hills when the land still joined onto the rest of Europe, when you could cross to what is now France without ever needing a boat, when the coastline was somewhere far out beneath the cold grey water of the North Sea. They built things, those people. They moved stones that weighed as much as houses. They raised mounds taller than churches. They carved enormous shapes into the white chalk of the hillsides, shapes so large that they can only really be seen from the sky. And then, for the most part, they left behind no explanation at all. No letters, no instructions, no reasons written down anywhere that we have ever found. Only the things themselves, standing patiently in the fields and on the hilltops and lying quietly under the turf, waiting. Tonight we are going to walk very slowly through some of those things, through the stone circles and the buried villages, through the drowned forests and the great earthen mounds and the graves that were opened and emptied and closed again. We are going to look at the mysteries that historians and archaeologists have studied for centuries, and still, if they are honest, cannot fully explain. Not the small puzzles with tidy answers, but the deep ones. The ones where the more carefully you look, the stranger and softer the picture becomes. There is no need to stay awake for any of this. Nothing here needs to be solved tonight. These questions have waited 4,000 years and longer, and they will wait a little longer still, gently, without complaint. So let the lights be low. Let your breathing slow down on its own. Let this voice carry you out across an old, old island, and if sleep should come for you somewhere before the end, then that is exactly as it should be. Before we begin walking, one small and quiet thing. If you find that this voice helps you drift off, if these long, slow journeys through the deep past are the kind of thing you would like to be able to find again on another restless night, then you might consider subscribing to the channel and perhaps tapping the small bell that sits beside it. That bell is simply the thing that lets you know when the next long story has been made ready, so that you never have to go searching for something calm at 1 o'clock in the morning. There is no need to do any of it now. There is no need to move at all. If you would rather simply lie still and listen, then simply lie still and listen, and let the rest of the world look after itself. But if at some point your hand happens to drift toward the screen, that small tap is all it takes, and then it is done, and you can let the screen go dark again and forget about it entirely. Now, let us go back. Back past the cities and the motorways and the neat hedged field boundaries. Back past the cathedrals and the castles and the names we think we know. All the way back to the beginning, to a wide chalk plain in the south of England, where the great stones are standing alone in the dark, exactly as they have stood for 5,000 years. The plain is called Salisbury Plain, and it is a quiet, open, slightly bare kind of country, the sort of place where the wind has a long way to travel and very little to stop it. In the middle of that plain stand the stones that almost everyone in the world has seen in a photograph, and that almost no one can truly explain. We call the place Stonehenge, which is an old Saxon name that means something close to the hanging stones, or the stones held up in the air, because that is the thing that strikes you first. Not just that the stones are large, though they are very large, but that some of them have been lifted up and laid across the tops of others, so that they hang there against the sky. People have been looking at Stonehenge and wondering about it for at least 900 years of written record, and almost certainly for thousands of years before anyone thought to write anything down. And here is the first quiet truth of the night. After all of that looking, after all of those centuries of careful study, after the digging and the measuring and the dating and the arguing, we still do not know why it was built. We know a great deal about how and a fair amount about when, and almost nothing at all about why. The monument keeps its central secret as well today as it kept it from the Romans, who walked past it and left it more or less alone, and from the medieval monks, who decided it must have been the work of giants or of the wizard Merlin, because no ordinary explanation felt large enough. Let us take the how first, because the how is strange enough on its own. The stones at Stonehenge are of two very different kinds, and they came from two very different places, and the difference between them is one of the great, unsolved puzzles of British prehistory. The huge, upright stones, the ones that form the familiar outer ring and the great horseshoe of paired giants inside it, are a kind of hard sandstone called sarsen. These are the heavy ones, the ones that can weigh 20, 30, even 40 tons apiece. The ones that seem impossible to move. For a long time, no one was quite sure where they had come from, and then, in recent years, a careful chemical study of their makeup matched almost all of them to a particular wooded area on the Marlborough Downs, around 15 miles to the north. 15 miles does not sound far when you say it quickly, but imagine moving a stone, the weight of several cars across 15 miles of rolling country, without wheels as we would know them, without iron tools, without horses trained to haul. Imagine the ropes, the timber sledges, the rollers, the sheer number of people leaning their whole bodies into the task, day after day, for one single stone, and then doing it again and again until dozens of them stood on the plain. We think it can be done that way. People have tried smaller versions of the experiment and made them work. But knowing that something is possible is not the same as understanding why anyone would choose to spend years of their lives doing it. And the sarsens are the easy part of the puzzle. The other stones at Stonehenge, the smaller ones, the ones that archaeologists call the blue stones because of the faint blue-grey colour they take on when they are wet or freshly broken, did not come from anywhere near Salisbury Plain. They came from Wales. They came from a range of rocky hills called the Priestley Hills in the far southwest of Wales, which is somewhere between 140 and 150 miles away from Stonehenge, depending on the route you imagine. These blue stones are smaller than the sarsens, but they are not small. Many of them weigh 2, 3, 4 tons, and someone, 5,000 years ago, decided that these particular stones from these particular hills were worth bringing all that way, across rivers, over or around mountains, perhaps partly by sea, floated along the coast on rafts, though that idea has its own difficulties, perhaps dragged the whole way overland. We have found the actual outcrops in Wales where some of the blue stones were quarried, places with names like Carn Godog and Craig Rossi Felin, and you can stand there today and see the stone still in the ground, the same stone, and the gap where pieces were taken. So we know the journey happened. We simply do not know why it mattered so much to them that the stones be these stones, and not some perfectly good, local stone that lay much closer to hand. There is a quiet and rather beautiful idea that some archaeologists have put forward in recent years, and it is the kind of idea that is lovely to fall asleep thinking about, whether or not it turns out to be true. The idea is this. Not far from those Welsh quarries there is a site called Warn Morn, where there once stood a stone circle of its own, an early one, now almost entirely gone, with only a few stones and a ring of empty holes left behind. And the suggestion is that this Welsh circle was taken down, deliberately, carefully, and carried away, and that the blue stones we see at Stonehenge today are that older monument, moved. That a community in Wales did not simply send stones to Salisbury Plain, but in some sense sent their whole sacred place, their circle, perhaps even moving themselves along with it, carrying their ancestors and their gathering point to a new home in the chalk country. If that is true, then Stonehenge is partly a Welsh monument in exile, a memory of somewhere else, rebuilt. It is only a theory. The evidence is argued over, but it gives the long stone-dragging journey a reason that feels human and grief-shaped and real. And then, only a few years ago, came another discovery that made the puzzle deeper still. At the very heart of Stonehenge lies a single, large flat stone, lying down rather than standing, that has been known for centuries as the altar stone. It is different from both the sarsen's and the blue stones, a pale sandstone all of its own. And when scientists examined its chemistry very closely, they found, to their genuine astonishment, that it does not match Wales at all. It seems to match the far northeast of Scotland, the country up around the Orkney coast, and the Moray Firth, somewhere in the region of 700 miles away. A stone lying at the centre of the most famous monument in Britain that may have travelled almost the entire length of the island to get there. Nobody expected that. Nobody can yet explain it. It tells us that the people who built Stonehenge were connected, somehow, across distances we used to think were far beyond them. That they were not isolated little groups, but part of something wide and reaching, a web of contact and exchange and shared belief that ran from the top of Scotland to the bottom of England. How they did it, and what it meant to them, and why this stone in particular, we do not know. We may never know. We can only lie here in the dark and turn it over gently. The thought of a flat pale stone being moved, slowly, for years, the length of a whole country, by people who believed it was worth it. The when of Stonehenge is clearer than the why, though it too holds surprises. The site was not built all at once by one generation to one plan. It grew and changed over a span of around 1500 years, which is a length of time difficult to truly feel. It is longer than the gap between us and the fall of Rome. The earliest version of Stonehenge, around 5,000 years ago, was not a ring of great stones at all. It was a roughly circular bank and ditch dug into the chalk, a quiet earthwork, and just inside it, a ring of pits. And into many of those pits, and across the site, the people of that time placed the burnt bones of their dead. For its first few centuries, Stonehenge was, above all, a cemetery, one of the largest known cremation cemeteries of its age anywhere in Britain. Before it was a place of standing stones, it was a place of the ancestors, a place where the dead were gathered and kept. Only later, after generations, did the great sarsen's and the blue stones arrive and rise, and the monument take on the shape we know. So when you picture Stonehenge, it helps to picture not a single act, but a long inheritance, a place worked and reworked by hundreds of years of descendants, each generation adding to and altering what the one before had left them, the way a family might extend a much-loved house. The lintels, the stones that lie across the tops of the uprights and give the monument its hanging look, were not simply balanced there. They were joined. The builders carved knobs on the tops of the upright stones and matching hollows in the underside of the lintels, so that each lintel sat down over its uprights and locked into place, the way a carpenter joins two pieces of wood with a peg and a socket. They even shaped the ends of the curved lintels so that they fitted together along the top of the great outer ring, like the links of a necklace. This is woodworking, done in stone, by people who had no metal hard enough to cut that stone easily, and who were almost certainly thinking in terms of timber, copying in everlasting rock the joints they knew from building in wood. The care of it is almost unbearable when you sit with it. Nothing about Stonehenge needed to be that precise in order to simply stand up. The precision was for something else, for correctness, for rightness, for reasons that mattered enormously to them and that they did not write down. And there is the alignment, which is the one thread of the why that we can almost grasp. Stonehenge is arranged so that it speaks to the sun at the two turning points of the year. On the longest day of summer, the midsummer solstice. The sun rises in a particular place on the horizon, and the monument frames that rising. And on the shortest day of winter, the midwinter solstice, the sun sets along the opposite line. Many archaeologists now think the midwinter sunset was the more important of the two, that the great gatherings happened in the dark, cold heart of the year, when the sun sank to its lowest point, and then, slowly, began to climb back. A monument built to mark the moment the light starts to return. That much we can say with some confidence. But knowing that the builders watched the sun does not tell us what they believed about it, or what they did at Stonehenge when they gathered, or what the place was for in their hearts. A temple, an observatory, a great calendar in stone, a place of healing, where the sick came hoping the blue stones held some power, a monument to the dead, a doorway between the living and the ancestors, a meeting place where scattered communities came together and, in the building of it, became one people. All of these have been argued, seriously, by serious people. All of them might be partly right. None of them can be proven. The stones stand on the plain and keep their silence, and the wind goes over them, and we are left, as every generation has been left, to wonder. To understand how strange Stonehenge truly is, it helps to know that it does not stand alone. It is not a single monument dropped onto an empty plain. It is the most famous piece of a vast and crowded sacred landscape, a whole countryside that the ancient people shaped and filled with meaning over thousands of years, and most of the rest of that landscape is just as puzzling as the stones themselves. Walk out from Stonehenge in any direction, and you are walking through their world. There are hundreds of burial mounds scattered across these few square miles. The rounded green humps that the locals later called barrows, each one raised over the dead, many of them placed carefully on the skyline so that they could be seen against the sky from the monument below. The living arranged their dead around Stonehenge, the way you might arrange seats around a stage. A little over a mile to the northeast of the stones lies one of the most overlooked and most baffling features of the whole landscape, a thing called the cursus. It is older than the standing stones of Stonehenge, older perhaps by 500 years. It is an enormous enclosure, long and thin, formed by a bank and ditch, running almost 2 miles from end to end and only a little over 100 meters wide. When it was first noticed, centuries ago, an antiquarian thought it looked like a Roman racetrack, a course for chariots, and so he gave it the Latin name for a race course, and the name stuck even though we now know it has nothing to do with the Romans or with racing. The truth is that nobody knows what a cursus is for. There are several of them in Britain, these long, narrow earthen avenues going nowhere, enclosing nothing in particular, often pointed roughly at the sunrise or the sunset, sometimes running down toward a river. They took a great deal of labour to build. They were clearly important, and they are to this day one of the genuine blank spaces in our understanding of the ancient British mind. A 2-mile-long enclosure, dug by hand into the chalk, for a purpose that left absolutely no trace we can read. Closer still, and stranger in its way, is the discovery of what the ancient people did with timber as well as stone. About 2 miles to the northeast, there was once a place we now call Dorrington Walls, and it was, in its day, one of the largest settlements in northern Europe. While Stonehenge was being raised and used, hundreds of people, perhaps thousands at the great gatherings, were living at Dorrington in a sprawl of small square houses, and they had built there their own great circular monuments, not of stone, but of standing timber, vast rings of huge oak posts. The picture that many archaeologists now hold is a haunting one. Stonehenge, built of stone, the everlasting material, was the domain of the ancestors and the dead. Dorrington, built of wood, the living material that grows and ages and decays, was the domain of the living. And the two were joined. Each had an avenue leading down to the River Avon, and the idea is that the people travelled between them by water, moving from the world of the living to the world of the dead and back again, perhaps carrying the remains of the newly dead downriver from the feasting place of the living to the silent stones. We have even found, from the animal bones left at Dorrington, that the great feasts there happened in midwinter, around the solstice, the very time the stones of Stonehenge were aligned to mark. Whole communities gathering in, the cold and the dark, eating and building and burying, in a landscape arranged around the turning of the sun. And as recently as a few years ago, when archaeologists thought they had surely mapped the main features of this landscape, they found something new and very large that nobody had suspected. Using instruments that can sense buried features without any digging, they detected a ring of enormous pits. Deep shafts cut into the chalk, arranged in a great circle more than a mile and a half across, encircling Durrington walls. Some 20 of these vast shafts have been identified, each one wide and deep, and the circle they form is so large that Durrington and its timber rings sit inside it like a yolk inside an egg. It may be the largest prehistoric structure ever found in Britain, and it had lain there, unnoticed, beneath ordinary farmland, through all the centuries of people studying this most studied of landscapes. Nobody knows what the ring of shafts was for. A boundary, a warning, a sacred edge marking the line between the ordinary world and the holy ground within. The simple fact that it could be found so recently, so close to the most examined ancient site in the country, is itself a quiet lesson. It tells us how much is still down there. It tells us that the ground of Britain is not yet finished speaking, and that the list of things we cannot explain is not a closed list, but an open one, still growing, even now. If you travel a little way north from Stonehenge, up into the gentler downland of Wiltshire, you come to a place that is, in some ways, even harder to explain, although far fewer people have heard of it. It is a stone circle too, but to call it a stone circle is almost to undersell it, because it is the largest stone circle in the world, and it is so large that an entire village sits comfortably inside it. The place is called Avebury, and the village of Avebury, with its houses and its lanes, and its old church and its pub, stands today within the ring of ancient stones. The modern world tucked inside the ancient one, like a small thing carried in a cupped hand. The scale of Avebury is the first thing that refuses to make easy sense. The builders dug a great circular ditch, and they dug it, not with metal, but with picks made from the antlers of red deer and shovels made from the shoulder blades of cattle. And they dug it deep, far deeper than it looks today, because the centuries have softened and filled it. They threw the chalk they had cut out up onto the outside to form a high white bank, so that the whole enclosure, when it was new, would have shone, a brilliant ring of dazzling white chalk a quarter of a mile across, visible for a long way over the green country. Inside that bank and ditch, they raised a great outer ring of standing stones, around 100 of them, huge rough blocks of local sarsen, and within that outer ring they built 2, possibly 3, smaller stone circles, each one a substantial monument in its own right. The amount of human effort buried in Avebury is staggering. It has been estimated in the millions of hours of labour, work that must have been spread across generations, across the whole working lives of people who were born, laboured and died with the monument still unfinished around them. And, as at Stonehenge, the great question is not how, but why, and the why is missing. There is no certain answer to the simplest question a child might ask, which is what was it for? There are no carvings on the Avebury stones that tell a story, no markings that we can read as words, no pictures, even, of the kind that might give us a clue. The stones were not even shaped for the most part. Unlike the carefully dressed and jointed sarsens of Stonehenge, the stones of Avebury were mostly left as they were found, and the builders seem to have chosen them, deliberately, for their natural shapes. Many of the stones fall into 2 rough types, and observers have long noticed it. Some are tall and slender, like pillars. Others are squat and broad, with a wide diamond or lozenge shape. It is tempting, and many have given in to the temptation, to see in this a pairing, a male form and a female form, a monument built around some idea of 2 natures, 2 principles, standing together in a ring. It may be so. It may be that we are simply seeing a pattern we want to see, the way the human mind always finds faces in clouds. The honest position is that we do not know, and that the people who raised these particular stones in these particular shapes knew exactly what they meant by it, and took that knowledge with them into the ground. Avebury has a darker chapter too, and it is part of its mystery because the monument was not only built, it was also attacked. In the Middle Ages, and again in the centuries after, the people living among the stones turned against them. Some of the great Sarsens were pulled down and buried in pits dug beside them, hidden away under the ground as though the villagers wished the stones had never existed. The medieval Christians of the village seem to have feared the old circle, to have felt it as something heathen and wrong in the middle of their lives, and so they toppled the stones into graves. Later, in a more practical and less fearful age, people simply wanted the stone for building, and they destroyed the great Sarsens by lighting fires against them and pouring cold water over the heated rock until it cracked, then breaking the pieces up for the walls of houses and barns. So when you walk Avebury today and see the gaps in the rings, the empty spaces where a stone should stand, you are looking at a kind of long, slow argument between the ancient world and the ages that followed it, a monument half raised and half unmade. In the 20th century, an archaeologist who was also by trade a marmalade millionaire devoted a fortune and years of his life to digging up the buried stones and standing them again. And where a stone could not be found, he set a small concrete marker in its place so that the ring could be read once more. Walking Avebury now is walking through that whole history at once. The building and the burying and the breaking and the patient raising up again. Leading away from the great circle at Avebury runs an avenue of paired standing stones, two long lines of Sarsens marching across the countryside for well over a mile. And it once joined Avebury to another monument, a smaller ring of stones and timber on a hilltop that was given, long ago, the strange and gentle name of the sanctuary. The avenue itself deepens the puzzle, rather than solving it, because here too the tall slender stones and the squat diamond stones seem to have been set deliberately opposite one another, pair after pair, the whole length of the walk, as though anyone moving along the avenue toward Avebury was meant to pass between two kinds of stone, two presences, the entire way. Processions, surely. Some slow ceremonial walking, some approach to the great circle that was meant to be done on foot and in order and with meaning. But what was said, or sung, or carried, or felt along that mile of paired stones is gone as completely as breath. And then, close to Avebury, rising out of the flat valley floor, so abruptly that the eye keeps returning to it, there is the strangest single object in all of prehistoric Britain. It is a hill, but it is not a natural hill. It is a mound, an artificial mound, raised entirely by human hands, and it is called Silbury Hill, and it's the largest mound built by people anywhere in prehistoric Europe. It stands around 40 meters high, which is the height of a fair-sized building, and it covers a wide area at its base. And it is made of many hundreds of thousands of tons of chalk and soil and turf, all of it cut and carried and piled up by a people working with antler picks and baskets and their own backs. The labour inside Silbury Hill is almost beyond imagining. The estimates run into the millions of working hours. It is, by any measure, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. And here is the thing that makes Silbury Hill so quietly astonishing, the thing that no one says quickly enough. We do not know what it is. We do not know what it was for. It is the largest artificial mound in prehistoric Europe, and it has no known purpose at all. Across the centuries, people simply assumed it must be a tomb, because a great mound surely covers a great burial. Surely some king or chieftain lies inside it under all that chalk, with his gold and his weapons around him. And so, again and again, people dug into Silbury Hill to find the burial at its heart. In the late 1700s, a group of miners sank a shaft straight down from the top. In the 1840s, a tunnel was driven in from the side. In the 1960s, a major excavation tunneled into it once more. With cameras, with the eyes of modern archaeology, and every time the searchers reached the center of the great mound and found nothing. No king, no tomb, no treasure, no burial of any kind. Silbury Hill is not, as far as anyone has ever been able to show, a grave. It is simply itself. An enormous, deliberate, beautifully engineered mound of earth, raised at colossal cost by a people who knew exactly why they were doing it, and who left, at its heart, for us to find, nothing at all but the chalk. What the modern tunneling did reveal, instead of a tomb, was the story of the building. Silbury Hill was not flung up in one heroic effort. It grew, like Stonehenge, in stages, over generations. It began as a smaller mound, and then that mound was enlarged, and then enlarged again, the hill swelling outward and upward across a long span of time. And one detail from the digging stays with you in the dark. Deep inside, in the oldest core of the mound, the excavators found the original ground surface preserved, sealed beneath everything that came after. And on it, they found summer grasses and the remains of insects. Evidence that the very first basketfuls of turf were laid down in high summer, possibly across a single particular season, by people who began this thousand-year task on what may have been one bright, warm, prehistoric day. Theories for what Silbury Hill meant have never stopped coming. A monument to a god or a goddess of the land, a vast symbol of the harvest, of the swelling fullness of the earth, a platform from which to watch the sky or to be seen. A statement of power, a thing built simply to be enormous, to say to everyone who saw it that the people who could raise such a hill were a people to be reckoned with. The most honest archaeologists will tell you that the building of it may have mattered more than any finished use, that the point of Silbury Hill was the centuries of working on it together, the shared and sacred labour itself. But that, too, is a guess, offered gently into a silence that has never answered back. Within sight of Silbury Hill, on a low ridge across the valley, lies a monument that is in some ways more readable, and yet it carries its own deep strangeness. It is called the West Kennet Long Barrow, and it is one of the finest of a kind of monument that the ancient British built long before Stonehenge or Avebury ever rose. The Long Barrow, the chambered tomb. It is a great elongated mound of earth and chalk, over 100 meters long, and at one end of it, behind a facade of large standing stones, there is a doorway, and beyond the doorway, a stone passage, and off the passage, a series of small stone chambers. This is a tomb, genuinely a tomb, and we know it because the dead were found inside it, the bones of dozens of people, men and women, the old and the very young, placed in the chambers across a long period of use that may have lasted 1,000 years or more. But even here, where we can say with confidence that this was a place for the dead, the way the dead were treated holds a mystery that unsettles our easy modern ideas about graves. The bodies in the West Kennet Long Barrow were not, for the most part, laid out whole and left in peace. The bones were sorted, they were rearranged. Skulls were grouped in some places, and long leg bones in others. Bones went missing from the tomb, and there are signs that bones were sometimes brought in from elsewhere. The chamber was not a final resting place in the way a modern grave is final. It seems to have been a place that was entered and worked within, again and again across the generations, a place where the ancestors were not buried and forgotten, but kept and handled and moved and perhaps carried out for ceremonies and then carried back. The boundary that we draw so firmly between the living and the dead seems to have been, for these people, something soft and crossable, a door rather than a wall. And then, at the end of the barrow's long life, the people who had used it for 40 or 50 generations chose to close it. They filled the passage and the chambers, deliberately, completely, with chalk rubble and earth and soil dense with the rubbish of ordinary life, packing it tight, and they sealed the entrance behind a row of huge blocking stones, shutting the tomb as firmly as if they were locking a door they never intended anyone to open again. Why a community would use a sacred place for 1,000 years and then, in a single decided act, seal it forever is one more of the quiet, unanswerable questions of this landscape. Perhaps a way of life was ending. Perhaps a belief had changed. Perhaps the ancestors inside were thought to have done their work, and it was time to let them rest, and time for the living to walk away. The stones were rolled across the door, and the long barrow fell silent, and it stayed silent, holding its sorted and scattered dead for the next 5,000 years. Now let us travel a long way north, much further north, off the top of the Scottish mainland, and across a stretch of cold and often rough water, to a scatter of green and treeless islands lying out in the North Sea. These are the Orkney Islands, and they are, although it seems an unlikely thing to say of somewhere so remote and so far from the warmth, one of the most important places in the entire ancient history of Britain. 5,000 years ago, when much of the rest of the island was a country of scattered farms and woodland, Orkney was something close to a centre of the world. Ideas seem to have been born here. The way of building in stone, the way of arranging the dead, perhaps even the very idea of the stone circle, may have flowed outward from these northern islands to the rest of Britain, rather than the other way around. The altar stone at the heart of Stonehenge, that pale slab that seems to have travelled the length of the country, may have been pointing us, all along, toward Orkney. The reason we can say so much about ancient Orkney, when so much of ancient Britain has rotted and vanished, comes down to a single practical fact. Orkney has almost no trees. It is a windswept place, and it always has been. And so the people who lived there, long ago, did not build their homes and their monuments from timber, as people did further south, where timber was everywhere and stone was scarce. The Orkney people built from stone, because stone was what they had. Flat, slabby stone that splits naturally into usable pieces, and stone does not rot. Stone endures. And so on Orkney, uniquely, we are not looking at the faint shadow of the ancient world, the post holes and stains that are all that timber leaves behind. We are looking at the thing itself, the actual walls, the actual rooms, the actual furniture, standing where the builders set it. The most famous of these survivals is a village called Skara, and the story of how it returned to the world is almost a story in itself. For thousands of years it had lain hidden, buried under a high grassy dune on the edge of a wide bay on the main island, completely forgotten, with no memory of it surviving in any record or legend. And then, one winter in the 1850s, a tremendous storm came in off the Atlantic, one of those great roaring storms that the islands know well, and the wind and the sea between them stripped the grass and the sand clean off the top of the dune. And when the storm had blown itself out and the islanders came to look, they found, emerging from the sand, the tops of ancient stone walls. The storm had unburied a village. It had torn the covers off a place that had been asleep since before the pyramids of Egypt were built. What the digging eventually revealed at Skara is the best preserved prehistoric village in northern Europe, and to walk through it now, or even to picture it in the mind, is to feel the distance between us and the ancient dead suddenly collapse into almost nothing. Here are small snug houses, several of them, joined together by low-covered passages, so that in the long dark Orkney winter a person could move from home to home without ever stepping out into the wind. The houses were partly sunk into a great mound of their own rubbish and earth, which insulated them, held the warmth in. And inside each house, because the builders worked in stone, the furniture has survived. There is a stone dresser standing against the wall facing the door, the first thing you would see on entering. Clearly a place to display whatever a household most valued. There are stone beds built into the walls, one on each side of the central hearth. There are small stone boxes set into the floor, their joints once sealed with clay, And the careful guess is that these were tanks for keeping shellfish alive, fresh bait ready to hand. There are little stone cupboards in the thickness of the walls. It is a home. It is unmistakably, achingly, a home. And the people who lived in it sat by that hearth and slept in those beds and kept their treasures on that dresser 5,000 years ago. And the great mystery of Skara Brae is not really how it was built or how it survived. The mystery of Skara Brae is the people. We can stand in their rooms, we can see where they slept, and we cannot hear a single word they ever said, or know a single one of their names, or learn what they hoped for, or feared, or believed. And there is a smaller, sharper mystery at Skara Brae too, which is how the village ended. The people of Skara Brae lived there for around 600 years, and then they left. And the leaving has an odd quality to it. In one of the passageways, the excavators found beads scattered along the ground, a broken necklace, as though someone fleeing in haste had caught the string on a doorway, and the beads had burst and rolled away, and there had been no time or no will to stop and gather them up. It is a tiny detail, a string of beads in the dirt, and it has made people wonder, ever since, whether the end of Skara Brae was sudden, whether the villagers left in a hurry, driven out by something, by an oncoming storm, by encroaching sand, by some trouble we cannot see, or whether the beads simply fell on some ordinary day, and the village faded out slowly, the way villages do, one family at a time, until the last door was left open and the sand began, year by year, to drift in. Skara Brae is only one piece of ancient Orkney, and in some ways not the strangest. On a narrow neck of land between two lochs, on the main island, there is a cluster of monuments so remarkable that the whole area has been recognised as a place of worldwide importance. At one end stand the stones of Stonehenge, the remains of what may be one of the oldest stone circles in all of Britain, a ring of very tall, very thin, very dramatic slabs, most of them now fallen or gone, but the few that remain, rising like great stone blades against the wide Orkney sky. Not far away stands the Ring of Brodgar, a huge and near perfect circle of standing stones set within a ditch carved out of the solid bedrock, a monument that rivals anything in the south for ambition and scale, raised here at the far northern edge of the world. And between those two great stone rings, on the narrow strip of land that joins them, archaeologists in this century uncovered something that genuinely rewrote the books. A site that had been suspected, then found, then slowly revealed to be far larger and far more important than anyone had dared to imagine. It is called the Ness of Brodgar. Beneath the turf of that narrow isthmus, there lies an enormous complex of stone buildings. Dozens of structures, some of them very large, with thick walls and paved areas and what appear to be decorated stones, built and rebuilt across many centuries. It was a place of huge significance, the beating heart, perhaps, of ceremonial Orkney, and it was in use for something like 1,000 years. And then it too came to an end, and the end of the Ness of Brodgar is one of the most extraordinary scenes in British prehistory. The evidence suggests that the people who used the site gathered there for one final time and held an immense feast, a feast at which they slaughtered and ate hundreds of cattle, an event of a scale that must have drawn people from across the islands and beyond. And then they decommissioned the place. They closed it down deliberately and seemed to have buried parts of it, ending 1,000 years of sacred use in one great act of feasting and farewell. Why a way of life that had endured for 40 generations should be brought to a deliberate close, with a feast and a burial, we do not know. But we have seen it now more than once. This pattern, the West Kennet long barrow sealed with blocking stones, the Ness of Brodgar closed after a final feast. Something in the ancient British world understood not only how to build sacred places, but how, when the time came, to end them, to put them gently and finally, to bed. The last of the great Orkney monuments is the one that perhaps comes closest to letting us into the ancient mind, and it is called Maeshowe. From the outside, it is a grassy mound, large and smooth and rounded, sitting alone in a field. But Maeshowe is hollow. Inside the mound there is a chamber, a fine high chamber of beautifully fitted stone, some of the slabs so huge that the building of it staggers belief, and reaching the chamber means passing along a low, straight, stone-lined passage, many meters long, a passage so low that a grown person must stoop or even crawl to go in. And that long, straight passage was not pointed at random. It was aimed with great care at the setting sun of midwinter. For most of the year, the chamber of Maeshowe lies in total darkness. But in the days around the winter solstice, the shortest, darkest days of the whole year, the setting sun lines up with the entrance, and its light travels the length of that long, low passage, and for a few minutes, the dark heart of the mound is filled with the deep golden light of the dying year. 5,000 years ago, the builders of Maeshowe understood the movement of the sun well enough, and cared about it deeply enough, and could build well enough, to construct a great stone chamber whose entire purpose was to catch and hold the light of midwinter, the moment when the year stands at its lowest and turns back toward the light. They did this in the far north, on a cold island, with no metal and no machines, and they did it so accurately that it still works. Today, every single year, the sun finding the chamber exactly as it was meant to. We do not know what they did inside Maeshowe in that golden light, or what they believed was happening, or who was allowed to be there. But of all the mysteries of ancient Britain, Maeshowe is the one where you can feel, most clearly, that the silence on the other side is not empty. There were minds there. There were people who watched the sky with patience and love, and who built, out of the cold stone of their cold island, a machine for catching hope, and aimed it at the darkest day of the year, and got it right. There is one more great northern monument to visit before we travel south again, and to reach it, we must cross from Orkney to another group of islands, the Outer Hebrides, lying off the northwest coast of Scotland in the open Atlantic. On the Isle of Lewis, on a low ridge above a sea, loch, in a landscape of bog and water and bare rock, there stands a monument called the Callanish Stones, and it is one of the most beautiful and most haunting of all the ancient places of Britain. It is a stone circle, but it is a stone circle that has had things added to it, until it is something more like a great stone figure laid out across the land. There is a ring of tall, thin stones at the centre, and within that ring, a single very tall stone stands like a held breath, and there is a small chambered tomb. And then, from the central ring, lines of standing stones run outward, a long avenue of them stretching away to the north, and shorter rows to the south, the east and the west, so that seen from above, the whole monument has the rough shape of a cross, or of a figure with outstretched arms, drawn on the ground in stone. The stones of Callanish are made of the local Lewisian gneiss, which is one of the oldest rocks on the surface of the earth, rock that was formed an almost unthinkable length of time ago, and the surfaces of the stones are streaked and banded and folded with the marks of that immense age, so that each stone seems to carry deep time visibly within it. The monument was built around 5,000 years ago, and like so many of these places, it was used and altered across many centuries. And like so many of these places, it points at the sky, although the alignment at Callanish is a strange and subtle one. It is not the sun that Callanish seems most concerned with, but the moon. There is a cycle of the moon, a slow rhythm that takes nearly 19 years to complete, in which the moon's path across the sky drifts to its furthest extremes and back again. At one point in that long cycle, seen from Callanish, the full moon of midsummer rises so low that it seems barely to clear the line of distant hills on the southern horizon, hills which, from the monument, have the rough shape of a reclining human body, a shape that local tradition has long called the Old Woman of the Moors, and the low moon in that part of its 19-year cycle appears to skim along the body of the sleeping hills, and then to set, and then, a short while later, to rise again briefly out of the very heart of the Callanish stones. To know that, to build for it, the people of ancient Lewis must have watched the moon with extraordinary patience across not just years but generations, passing the knowledge down, waiting through the long, slow turning of that cycle to see the rare alignment come round again. We cannot prove that this was the intention of the builders. The moon is harder to read in stone than the sun. But standing at Callanish, on its lonely ridge above the Atlantic, it is very difficult not to feel that this is a place built by people who knew the sky the way we know the faces of our families, and who set up these ancient stones to mark a meeting, once in a generation, between the moon and the land. Now let us come south again, all the way south, back to the chalk country of England, because there is a kind of ancient British mystery that we have not yet looked at. And it is a kind that you do not walk up to and around the way you walk up to a stone circle. It is a kind you have to step back from. It is a kind that, in some cases, you cannot really see at all unless you are looking down from the sky. The chalk hills of southern England have a thin skin of green turf over brilliant white rock, and the ancient people discovered that if you cut away the turf in the right shape, you can draw on the hillside in white. An image scoured into the land itself, a picture made of chalk. And the strangest and oldest and most beautiful of all these chalk drawings lies on a hillside in Oxfordshire, and it is called the Uffington White Horse. The Uffington White Horse is not really a mystery of how, because the how is simple enough to grasp. People cut trenches into the hillside, down through the turf to the chalk, and then they filled and packed those trenches with broken white chalk, and so the figure is drawn in lines of bright white across the green of the down. The mystery of the Uffington White Horse is everything else. It is, first of all, astonishingly old. For a long time, people assumed it must be from the Saxon age, or the time of King Alfred 1,000 or so years ago, because that felt old enough for anything. But a careful scientific dating, looking at the soil within the cut trenches, pushed the age of the horse far, far back, into the late Bronze Age, or the early Iron Age, around 3,000 years ago. It is one of the oldest hill figures in the world, and it has been lying on that hillside, gleaming for 3,000 years. And here is the part that makes the Uffington horse a true and unsolvable mystery. A chalk figure cut into a hillside is one of the most fragile things imaginable. The turf does not stay away. Grass grows, soil washes down, weeds creep in from the edges. A chalk figure left alone for even 20 or 30 years will simply close over and vanish, healed shut by the hillside, gone as though it had never been. Which means that the Uffington White Horse cannot possibly have survived for 3,000 years on its own. It has survived only because, for 3,000 years, in an unbroken chain, generation after generation after generation of local people have climbed that hill and weeded the figure and repacked the trenches with fresh white chalk, an act of maintenance that came to be called the scouring of the horse, and that was, in later centuries, the occasion for a great fair and festival on the down. Think about what that means. Think about the length of that chain. The horse was already more than 1,000 years old when the Romans came. It was already ancient when the Saxons arrived, when the Normans came, through every century of English history that has a name, and in every one of those centuries, in living memory, of no original reason whatsoever, people kept climbing the hill and keeping the horse alive. They did not know why the horse was there. The reason had been lost for thousands of years. And still they came, and still they scoured it. And so it is here. Nobody knows what the people who first cut it meant by it. It may not even be a horse. The figure is strange, abstract, stretched and flowing. more like the spirit or the idea of a horse than a drawing of a real animal, and some have wondered whether it was meant to be a dragon or a creature with no name we would recognize. Below the hill, there is a curious flat-topped natural mound that legend ties to the dragon slain by St. George. We do not know. We only know that for 3,000 years the people of One English Valley have refused, without ever quite being able to say why, to let the white horse fade. Not all the chalk figures of England are so old, and that is part of their puzzle too, because they look ancient and they feel ancient, and yet some of them may not be. On a steep green hillside in Dorset, there is a figure that almost everyone in Britain has seen. A giant, an enormous naked man outlined in chalk, striding down the slope, a great club raised in one hand. He is called the Cairn Abbas Giant, and he is 180 feet tall, and he is, to put it gently, anatomically, very bold, a frank and startling figure that has embarrassed and delighted people in equal measure for as long as anyone can remember. The Cairn Abbas Giant feels as though he must be unimaginably old, a pagan god, a fertility figure from the deep prehistoric past. And for centuries, that is what people assumed he was. But here is the strange thing. Unlike the Uffington horse, there is no record of the Cairn Giant in any document before the late 1600s. For such a huge and striking and frankly unmissable figure to go entirely unmentioned by every monk and writer and traveller for thousands of years is very hard to explain if he is truly ancient. And when, recently, scientists managed to date the lowest layers of his chalk, the result suggested that the giant may have been first cut not in the deep pagan past at all, but only a few hundred years ago, somewhere around the time he first appears in the records. And yet, the dating also hinted that the figure had been neglected, allowed to grass over and nearly vanish, and then rediscovered and recut, so that even his real age is tangled. Was he a genuine ancient god, lost and found again? Was he a piece of 17th century mockery, a giant cut into a hillside as a crude joke at the expense of some local landowner or politician? Was he something in between, an old idea, given a new body? The Cairn Abbas giant stands on his hillside, club raised, and will not say. There is a third great chalk figure, gentler than the giant, stranger in his own way than the horse, and he stands on a steep slope of the South Downs in Sussex. He is called the Long Man of Wilmington, and he is the tall outline of a man, more than 200 feet high, standing facing the viewer, holding a long straight staff in each hand, one on either side, like a figure, standing in a doorway with a hand on each post. He is calm and faceless and curiously flat, and his proportions are subtly adjusted, so that, seen from below on the slope, he does not look stretched or distorted, but correct, which means whoever laid him out understood something about drawing on a hillside. The long man has been argued over endlessly. He has been called a Bronze Age god and a Roman soldier and a Saxon warrior and a medieval pilgrim and the work of an idle monk from the priory that once stood nearby, and a survey of the figure suggested that, at least in the form we see today, he might be only a few centuries old, though he may well preserve the outline of something much older beneath. The staffs in his hands have been called spears, and rakes, and the two posts of a doorway, and beams of light, and the tools for some forgotten rite. Nobody knows who he is, or what he is holding, or why he was set facing out from that particular hill. He simply stands there, on the green slope, holding his two staffs, looking down at the small fields, and the small roads, and the small modern lives passing below him, patient and silent and entirely unexplained. The way all of these chalk figures are patient and silent, drawings left on the land by hands that are gone, pictures whose captions were never written down. So far, almost everything we have looked at has been built of stone or carved into the chalk, and that is no accident, because stone and chalk are the things that last. The deep past survives best where it was written in hard and patient materials. But the ancient people of Britain did not build only in stone. They built, far more often, in wood, in timber cut from the great forests that once covered most of the island, and timber rots. Timber returns to the soil. An entire world of ancient British building, almost certainly the larger part of it, has simply decayed away and left us nothing but stains in the earth. Which is why, every so often, when a piece of that wooden world is found preserved by some accident of mud or water, it feels like a message arriving from a place we thought was permanently silent. And there is no stranger such message than the one that appeared one spring on a beach in Norfolk. The beach is a wide flat one on the North Norfolk coast, the kind of beach where at low tide the sea draws back a very long way over sand and mud. And in the spring of the year, the shifting sands and tides expose something that the local people had never seen before, something that had been hidden under the beach. For a very, very long time, it was a ring of timber, a circle of wooden posts, dozens of them, oak posts set close together in the sand to form a roughly circular enclosure a few meters across, their tops jagged and worn by the sea. And in the very center of that ring of posts, there was one more piece of timber, and it was the strangest of all, because it was a great tree stump, an entire oak tree, and it had been set into the ground upside down, with its heavy root mass pointing at the sky and its trunk buried below. The newspapers very quickly named the place Stonehenge, and although the name is not quite accurate, because it was never by the sea when it was built, and it's not really a henge, the name stuck, the way the name Stonehenge stuck, because some places simply demand a name that sounds like a riddle. Stonehenge was built, the tree rings told us with remarkable precision, around 4,000 years ago, in the early Bronze Age, and the timbers had survived all those millennia because the place where they stood, once an area of marsh and mudflat well back from the shore, had been sealed under waterlogged peat, and waterlogged peat keeps out the air, and without air the wood could not rot. The sea, in the long, slow rearranging of that coast, had only recently uncovered it, and because the timbers were so astonishingly well preserved, archaeologists could read them in a way that is almost never possible. They could see the individual marks left by the bronze axes that had felled and trimmed the trees, and by studying those marks, they worked out that the wood had been worked by a good number of different axes, perhaps as many as 50, which suggests that the building of Stonehenge was a job done by a whole community. Many people, each bringing their own tool, all of them gathering on the marsh to raise this one strange circle around its one strange upturned tree. And what was it for? As always, that is the question with no flaw to it. The most widely repeated idea, and it is a powerful and a moving one, is that Stonehenge was a place for the dead. The upturned oak at the center, with its roots reaching up, may have been an altar of a kind, a surface raised toward the sky, and the suggestion is that a body was laid there, up among the roots, and left open to the air and the birds, so that the flesh would be taken, and only the clean bones would remain, to be gathered afterward and buried elsewhere. A circle to hold the dead while the world unmade them, an inside-out tree for an in-between time, the time between a death and a final burial. It is only an idea. Stonehenge has also been called a shrine, a sacred enclosure, a monument tied to some belief about the upside down and the turning of worlds. What is certain is that it was deliberate and communal and strange, and that the people who built it had a reason that filled their minds completely and reached us not at all. Stonehenge has a quiet, sad coda too. When it was found, there was a long and painful argument about what to do with it. The sea was destroying it, slowly, every tide. To leave it was to lose it. And so, in the end, and against a great deal of local feeling that the circle should be allowed to stay where it had always stood and meet its end with dignity, the timbers were lifted out of the beach and taken away to be preserved, and today they can be seen in a museum, behind glass. the upturned tree and its ring of posts, saved from the sea and exiled from their place. Whether that was a rescue or a second kind of loss is a question almost as hard, in its small human way, as the question of what the circle was for. If Stonehenge shows us how much the waterlogged ground can save, there is another site, this one in the flat, wet country of Cambridgeshire, that shows it more completely and more astonishingly than anywhere else in Britain. It is called Must Farm, and it has been given a nickname that tells you at once why it matters. It has been called Britain's Pompeii. Around 3,000 years ago, in the late Bronze Age, a small community built themselves a settlement here, and the way they built it was to drive wooden posts down into the bed of a slow river and raise a cluster of large round houses up on a platform above the water. Snug houses with thatched roofs, a little village standing on stilts over a river in the fens. They had not lived there very long, perhaps less than a year, when disaster came. A fire broke out, and the burning houses, with everything in them, collapsed off their stilts and fell down into the river below, into the soft silt and the water, where the mud closed over the wreckage and the lack of air stopped the rot, and there it all stayed, sealed for 3,000 years. What the archaeologists found at Must Farm, when they finally excavated it, was not the faint shadow of the Bronze Age, but the Bronze Age itself, caught in the act of an ordinary day. They found the timbers of the houses, they found the roof structures, they found pots, whole pots, complete sets of them in graded sizes, and inside some of those pots they found the actual food that had been in them when the fire came. The remains of meals, one bowl still holding a kind of porridge or stew with a wooden spoon resting in it. They found textiles, cloth made from plant fibers, woven with a fineness that astonished people who had assumed Bronze Age cloth must be coarse. They found glass beads that had travelled from far away. They found tools and weapons and the small wooden objects of daily life, buckets and platters and a wheel. They found, in short, the contents of people's homes, the things they had been living among on the day the fire started, and because the people themselves seemed to have escaped, the village stands in the record not as a tomb, but as a moment, a single interrupted day in the late Bronze Age, frozen and kept. And here is where Must Farm, for all that it explains, deepens the mystery rather than closing it. Because the things that the people of Must Farm left behind do not match the story we used to tell ourselves about how poor and how simple and how struggling ancient life must have been. These were people with fine woven cloth and a wide range of well-made pottery and beads carried from distant lands and a comfortable, well-provisioned way of living. They were not scraping by. They were doing well. And the fire itself is a mystery within the mystery. Was it an accident, a stray spark in a thatched roof over a dry summer? Or was it deliberate? There are hints that the settlement may have been defended, ringed with a fence of sharpened posts, and there are scholars who wonder whether the fire was an attack, whether this small prosperous village on the river was burned by someone and its people driven out into the fen. We have their houses, we have their dinner still in the pot. We do not have the one thing we want, which is the answer to the simple question of what happened here and who, if anyone, did this, and why a thriving little community on a fenland river should end so suddenly in fire and fall into the dark of the mud for 3,000 years. There is one more kind of ancient working of the land that we should walk through before we leave the Bronze Age behind, and it lies under the heath country of Norfolk. And it is a place where the ancient British went down into the earth. It is called Grimes Graves, which is a name given much later by the Anglo-Saxons, who came upon a strange pitted landscape of hollows and mounds, and assumed it must be the work of a god they called Grim, a name for Odin, and called the hollows his graves. But they are not graves at all. Grimes Graves is a flint mine, the largest and most dramatic of the Neolithic flint mines of Britain, and the pitted surface that puzzled the Saxons is the scar left by hundreds of mine shafts. Hundreds of them, sunk into the earth more than 4,000 years ago. The ancient people dug at Grimes' graves because they were after a particular thing, a layer of very high-quality flint, the best flint, the kind that naps cleanly and sharply, that lay buried deep beneath the surface. To reach it, they sank shafts down through the chalk, some of them more than 10 meters deep, straight down with antler picks and baskets, and then, at the bottom, where they met the good flint, they tunneled outward, crawling along, low galleries radiating from the foot of the shaft, hacking the precious black flint out of the chalk in the dark by the light of small lamps. It is hard, frightening, dangerous work to imagine. The squeeze of those low galleries, the weight of the earth above, the dark, the dust, the smell of the chalk, and people did it for generations, again and again, sinking shaft after shaft across the heath. When one shaft was worked out, they backfilled it, often with the spoil from digging the next, and moved on, and so the surface slowly became the strange, dimpled country that the Saxons found. The mystery of Grimes' graves is partly a mystery of effort and meaning. The labour of mining flint that deep was enormous, and it has made people wonder whether flint from a place like Grimes' graves was simply useful, or whether it was also special, whether flint pulled from deep in the earth carried a value beyond its sharpness, a worth that came from where it had been, from the courage and the darkness of the getting of it. And there is one particular find from Grimes' graves that has fueled this wondering for over a century. In one of the mine shafts, long ago, excavators reported finding, set out carefully at the foot of the workings, a small, carved chalk figure of a rounded female form, often called the Grimes' Graves Goddess, together with an arrangement of antler picks and a chalk ball and a chalk lamp, as though someone had made an offering at the bottom of the mine, a small shrine to bring good fortune to the digging, or to thank the earth for what was taken from it. It is a haunting picture, the little chalk goddess in the dark at the bottom of the shaft. But it is also, and this is very much part of the mystery, a find that some scholars have come to suspect was not genuine at all, that the figure and its arrangement may have been planted, faked, by someone on the dig who wanted to find something wonderful. We cannot now be sure, and so even here, deep in a real and undoubted ancient mine, there sits a small, unresolved question, a little carved figure that is either one of the most moving objects in British prehistory or one of its quiet frauds, and we may never know which, and the not knowing is, by now, an old familiar companion on this long walk through the dark. We have spent a long time now among the things that the ancient British made, the circles and the mounds and the mines and the drowned villages, and all this, while a quiet question has been gathering at the edge of the dark, waiting to be asked. Who were they? Who were the people who dragged the stones and dug the shafts and scoured the white horse into the hill? We talk easily about the builders of Stonehenge, the people of Skara Brae, the families of Moss Farm, as though they were one long, unbroken people, the ancestors of the British, a single thread running down from the deep past to the present, and one of the strangest and most unsettling discoveries of recent years, a discovery made not with spades, but with the study of ancient bone and ancient genes, is that this comfortable picture is not true. The story of the people of ancient Britain is not the story of one people slowly changing in place. It is a story of arrivals and of replacements, of whole populations sweeping in and whole populations vanishing, and it turns the deep past into something far more turbulent, far more dramatic, and far more haunting than the quiet green countryside it left behind would ever suggest. To feel this, it helps to begin with a single individual, a man who has been given the name Cheddar Man. He was found in a cave in the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, that dramatic deep limestone canyon in the southwest of England, and he is the oldest, more or less complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. He lived around 10,000 years ago, in the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, in the long stretch of time after the last great ice had retreated and before farming had arrived, when the people of Britain still lived entirely by hunting and gathering and fishing, moving through a wooded land, taking what the seasons gave. For a long time, Cheddar Man was just an old skeleton, important but silent. And then, in this century, scientists succeeded in recovering ancient genetic material from the bone, and they read it, and what it told them about this 10,000-year-old hunter rearranged a great many assumptions. The genes indicated, with reasonable confidence, that Cheddar Man, this early Briton, this ancestor figure standing near the root of the island's human story, had dark skin, dark curly hair, and pale, bright, light-colored eyes. The pale skin that we think of as typical of Northern Europe had not yet arrived. It came later, with later peoples. And so the very oldest face we can put to ancient Britain is not the face most people picture. And Cheddar Man stands at the start of the story as a quiet reminder that the past does not look the way we assume it looks, and that the island has always been a place that people came to, rather than a place that people simply were. After the hunters, like Cheddar Man, came the first great transformation, the arrival of farming, and the genetic story tells us this was not simply a clever new idea that the hunters of Britain heard about and adopted. It came with people. Around 6,000 years ago, farmers crossed into Britain, people whose deeper ancestry traced back to the lands around the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia, the region where farming had first begun, and who had spread slowly across Europe over many generations, bringing their crops and their animals and their way of life with them. These were the people who would clear the forests and raise the long barrows and build the first stone circles and begin the great monumental tradition that would one day include Stonehenge. And the ancient genes suggest that when these farmers arrived, the older hunting peoples of Britain, the people of Cheddar Man's distant lineage, faded from the record with surprising speed and completeness. The new way of life did not blend gently with the old. It largely replaced it. The hunters of Britain, who had owned the island for thousands of years, became, genetically, almost a whisper. And then it happened again. This is the part of the story that touches Stonehenge directly, and that gives it one of its most poignant and least-known mysteries. The farming people who built the long barrows and raised the first stones at Stonehenge and Avebury, the people who created that whole monumental world, were themselves, in their turn, swept aside. Around 4,500 years ago, not long after the great Sarsens were raised on Salisbury Plain, a new people began to arrive in Britain from across the sea, part of a vast movement that had spread across Europe from the grasslands far to the east. Archaeologists had long known them by the distinctive bell-shaped pots they made and buried with their dead, and so they called them the Beaker people, after the Beakers, and for a long time there was a gentle argument about whether the Beaker culture was just a fashion, a set of objects and ideas that spread from group to group, or whether it was carried by an actual movement of human beings. The ancient genes have now answered that, and the answer is stark. It was people. The Beaker folk came in numbers, and within a span of only a few centuries, only a handful of generations, the genetic makeup of the population of Britain was almost completely transformed. The descendants of the farmers who built Stonehenge were very largely replaced. The new people had a different ancestry, a different look, a different inheritance, and they became the overwhelming majority. Stonehenge had been standing for only a few hundred years, still relatively young as a monument, and already the people who built it were, in the most literal genetic sense, all but gone from the land, and a new people were living among their stones. Sit with that for a moment in the dark, because it is one of the strangest facts in this whole long night of strange facts. The greatest monument of ancient Britain was, within a few centuries of its building, inherited by people who were not the descendants of its builders, who had come from somewhere else, who may not have known, or may have known, only as a dim and fading story, what the great stones were for, or who had raised them. The mystery of why we cannot explain Stonehenge is, in part, this. There may have been no unbroken chain of memory to carry the explanation forward. The knowledge may have walked off the edge of the world with the people who held it, and the new people, the Beaker people, our own much closer ancestors, may have stood among the stones almost as puzzled as we are. And it did not stop there. In the centuries that followed, more movements of people came into Britain, more arrivals from the European mainland during the Bronze Age, each one shifting the makeup of the population again. The deep history of the British is not a tree with a single trunk. It is a river, fed by stream after stream, and the water that flows in it now is not the water that flowed in it then. There is one ancient Britain, more than any other, who lets us feel this churning, restless, wide-travelling quality of the prehistoric world, and he was found near Stonehenge itself, in a grave, uncovered, during the building of a new housing estate at Amesbury, only a few miles from the great stones. He has been called the Amesbury Archer, because his grave, one of the richest early Bronze Age graves ever found in Britain, contained among its many objects a set of beautifully made flint arrowheads and the stone wrist guards that an archer wears. And he lived right around the time the great Sarsens were being raised at Stonehenge, perhaps a little before, perhaps just as the work was underway. His grave was extraordinary. It held copper knives and gold ornaments among the very oldest gold objects ever found in Britain, and the equipment for working metal, and the beaker pots, and the archery gear, the burial of a man who was clearly important, clearly wealthy, clearly someone. And then the scientists examined the chemistry locked into his tooth enamel, the chemistry that records, from the water a person drank in childhood, the kind of place where that childhood was spent. And the answer was a surprise. The Amesbury Archer had not grown up in Britain at all. He had grown up somewhere in the cold, mountainous heart of Europe, in or near the Alps, hundreds of miles away. He had been born far across the sea and the land, and at some point in his life, he had travelled the whole long way to Britain, and he had ended his days in the shadow of Stonehenge, and there he had been buried with great honour and great wealth. We do not know why he came. We do not know what drew a man from the Alps to Salisbury Plain 4,500 years ago. Perhaps he was one of the people who carried the new knowledge of metalworking into Britain, and was honoured for it as a person of rare and valuable skill, almost a kind of magician, someone who could pull bright metal out of dull rock. Perhaps he came as a pilgrim, drawn by the fame of the great monument that was rising on the plain, for there is even a suggestion, from the wear and damage to his bones, that he walked with difficulty, with an old injury, and it has been wondered, gently and unprovably, whether he came to Stonehenge as the sick once came, hoping for healing. We cannot know. But the Amesbury Archer stands in the record as proof, a single human proof, that the world of ancient Britain was not small and not closed and not still. It was a world where a man could be born among the high Alps and die beside Stonehenge, where stones travelled from Wales and from Scotland, where whole peoples crossed the sea and remade the population of an island. A world of movement and distance and connection, restless under its quiet green surface. And almost everyone in it, the archer from the Alps, the vanished farmers, the dark-skinned hunter in the Cheddar Cave, the builders and the rebuilders and the replaced, lies now under the turf of Britain in unmarked and unremembered ground, their names gone, their reasons gone, their long journeys reduced to a chemical trace in the enamel of a tooth, waiting in the dark to be found, or never to be found, beneath the fields. There is a kind of ancient mystery that does not come to us as stone or as earthwork, or as the trace of a gene, but as something far more direct and far more difficult, and that is the body itself. Most of the ancient dead of Britain have long since returned to the earth, their bones dissolved in acid soils until nothing is left, or burned to fragments, or scattered. But in certain places, in the dark, wet peat bogs that lie in the cold parts of the island, a body can be kept. The peat bog is a strange preserving thing. The water in it is acidic and cold and starved of oxygen, and a body that goes down into a bog and is sealed, there does not rot in the ordinary way. The bog tans it, the way leather is tanned, darkening the skin and turning it tough and supple, and it can hold a person, recognizably a person, with skin and hair and the lines of the face and even the contents of the stomach, for 2,000 years and more. And every so often, in Britain and across the bog country of northern Europe, the cutting of peat for fuel has brought one of these ancient people back up into the daylight, and each time it happens, it is less like an archaeological discovery and more like meeting someone. The most famous of the British bog bodies was found in a peat bog at Lindo Moss, in Cheshire, in the northwest of England, and he has come to be known, half affectionately, as Lindo Man, although the workers who first found a piece of him reaching out of the peat thought, understandably, that they had uncovered a recent crime. What had in fact come up out of the bog was the remarkably preserved body of a man who had died around 2,000 years ago, in the Iron Age, around the time the Romans were arriving in Britain. He was a young man, healthy, well-built, with trimmed hair and a neatly kept beard, his fingernails smooth and well cared for, the body of someone who had not spent his life in heavy labour, someone, perhaps, of a certain standing. And the reason Lindo Man is not only a wonder, but a genuine and disturbing mystery is the manner of his death, because the bog preserved that too, in detail, and the detail is hard to sit with. Lindo Man did not die gently, and he did not, it seems, die in any one simple way. The evidence on his body suggests a death of layered and deliberate violence. He appears to have been struck hard on the head, more than once, blows heavy enough to fracture the skull. He appears to have been struck, or had his neck broken. There was a cord, a thin, twisted cord, drawn tight around his neck, tight enough to have been a garrote, and there is a wound at his throat, as though the throat had also been cut. Any one of these things would have been enough to kill a man. Lindo Man seems to have suffered several of them, in close sequence, and then his body was placed, face down, into a pool in the bog. To the people who study these things, this layering of violence does not read as an ordinary murder, or an execution, or the chaos of a fight. It reads as something formal, something done in a particular order, for particular reasons, a death that was not merely a killing, but a procedure, a rite, and so Lindo Man is most often spoken of as a sacrifice, a human sacrifice offered by his own people, to something, for some reason, in the cold, uncertain years around the coming of Rome. And that is where the mystery opens out beneath him, like the bog itself, dark and without a flaw. If Lindo Man was a sacrifice, then almost every question we might ask about it has no answer. Who was he that he was chosen? Was he a willing victim, an honoured one, someone who agreed or believed or was raised to it? Was he a captive, an enemy, a criminal, a stranger? The contents of his stomach were preserved, and they told us that his last meal was a simple one, a kind of griddle cake of grain, eaten not long before he died, and there has been speculation, impossible to prove, about whether there was something significant in that final bread, whether it carried some meaning, whether the choosing of the victim was tied to it. Was his death meant to turn away a danger, to end a famine, to buy the favour of a god, to mark some terrible moment, the threat of the Roman armies, perhaps, the sense of a world about to end? We do not know. We have his face, calm now in the museum case, dark and flattened by the centuries, but still a face, still a young man's face. We have, in a sense, everything. We have the body, the meal, the wounds, the cord, and we do not have the one thing that would make sense of it all, which is the reason, the belief, the fear in the minds of the people who stood around him at the edge of the bog and did this thing in their careful and deliberate order. Lindo man is not the only one. Across the bogs of Britain and Ireland and Denmark and northern Germany, other ancient people have come up out of the peat, some of them showing the same signs, the same formal violence, the same placing in the water, and together they tell us that this was not a single madness but a practice, something the ancient peoples of northern Europe did, across a wide region and a long time, and understood completely, and never explained to anyone who could pass the explanation on to us. The bog bodies belong to a much larger and equally puzzling pattern in the ancient British world, a pattern of giving things to the water. Again and again, across thousands of years, the ancient people of Britain took objects, and not poor or worthless objects, but the very finest things they possessed, the things that must have cost the most labour and carried the most value and the most pride, and they put them deliberately into rivers and lakes and bogs and pools, into the wet places, and let them go, with no apparent intention of ever getting them back. To the modern mind, this is a baffling thing to do. We are used to treasure being hidden so that it can be recovered, buried in the ground in fear, in the hope of digging it up again when danger passes. But this is not that. This is treasure, given away to the water, on purpose, forever. The rivers of Britain, when they have been dredged, or when their old courses have been dug through, have given up an astonishing quantity of beautiful ancient metalwork, and the finest of it is some of the finest work the ancient British ever did. From the Thames came a shield, the one we call the Battersea Shield, a sheet of bronze made not for the hard business of war at all, too thin and too fine for that, but made to be seen, its face worked into flowing, curling, swirling patterns and set with glowing red enamel, a parade piece, a thing of pure display and pride. It went into the river. From the Thames also came a strange and unforgettable bronze helmet with two tall curving horns rising from it. The Waterloo helmet, a thing that looks almost too dramatic to be real, and it too was given to the water. Swords, beautifully made swords, were bent or broken first and then dropped into rivers and bogs, and the bending seems to be part of the act, as though the sword had to be killed, ended, made useless to the living world, before it could be given to the other one. Whole cauldrons, shields, spearheads, ornaments, the wealth of communities went down into the wet and the dark. Why? The honest answer, once again, is that we are guessing, but the guesses gather around a single idea, which is that the ancient British believed the water was a way through to somewhere else, that rivers and springs and bogs and lakes were not simply features of the landscape, but thresholds, places where the world of the living pressed up against the world of the gods, or the dead, or the powers that ran beneath everything. To give a fine thing to the water was to send it across that threshold, as an offering, as a gift, as a payment, as a prayer. Perhaps it was done in thanks, perhaps it was done in fear. Perhaps a great sword was given to the river to mark the death of the great person who had carried it, the weapon following its owner across. There is an echo of all this that almost everyone in Britain knows without knowing where it comes from. The old story of a king's sword that must at the end be thrown out into the lake, and of a hand that rises from the water to catch it. That story is medieval in the form we know it, but the feeling inside it, the sense that a sword's true and proper end is to be given to the water, may be a memory far older than any king named in any tale, a memory reaching all the way back to these ancient people standing at the edges of their rivers, letting their most beautiful things slip down into the dark, certain, in a way we can no longer share, that the water would carry them where they were meant to go. There is one last object of this kind worth holding in the mind, because it is so strange and so splendid, and it was not given to water, but placed in the ground with the dead, and it is called the Mould Cape. It was found in Wales, at a place called Mould, by workmen breaking up an ancient burial mound, and what they found, crushed around the remains of a body, was a garment beaten out of a single astonishing sheet of pure gold. The Mould Cape is shaped to fit closely over the shoulders and the upper chest, and its entire surface is worked into row upon row of fine raised decoration, beads and ribs and lines, imitating, it is thought, the look of multiple strings of necklace beads, an entire ceremonial costume of jewellery rendered in solid gold. It was made around 4,000 years ago, in the Bronze Age, by a goldsmith of breathtaking skill, and it is so closely fitted and so delicate that whoever wore it could barely have moved their arms, could certainly not have done any ordinary work or fighting in it. It was made to be worn while standing still, while being seen, while being, perhaps, something more than an ordinary person for the length of a ceremony. And then it went into the ground, around the body of someone whose name and rank and story are entirely lost. We do not know who wore the Mould Cape. We do not know whether it clothed a king or a priest or a priestess, a chieftain or a god made briefly flesh in human form for a festival. We have the cape, gleaming and complete and miraculous, and we do not have the shoulders it was made for, or the voice that spoke from above it, or the eyes that watched the firelight move across all that worked gold, and that, by now, on this long night, will be a familiar shape of loss. The thing surviving in perfect beauty, and the meaning of it gone entirely into the dark. For a very long stretch of this night, we have been walking through a Britain with no writing in it at all. A Britain that left us things, but never left us words, and that is the deepest reason its mysteries are so complete. But there came a time when writing arrived on the island, carried by an army, and you might think that from that moment the mysteries would end, that the darkness would lift, and history proper would begin. It is not so. The Romans came to Britain, and the Romans wrote things down, and yet some of the most teasing and most argued over mysteries of the whole British past belong precisely to the Roman centuries, because the Romans wrote down some things and not others, and because the things they did not bother to explain are often the very things we now most want to know. The Romans first came to Britain with Julius Caesar, who crossed the sea twice, briefly, and then left, and they came in earnest a century later, in the invasion that began the long Roman occupation of the southern part of the island, an occupation that would last for getting on for 400 years. They built towns and roads that still run dead straight across the modern countryside, and forts and grand houses with underfloor heating and painted walls, and they pushed their control north and west until they met country and peoples they could not, or chose not to, fully conquer. And it is in the wild north, on the edge of the Roman world, that one of the most enduring of all British mysteries is set, the mystery of the lost Ninth Legion. A Roman legion was an enormous thing, a body of thousands of trained soldiers, a city of men on the move, with its own number and its own name and its own long, proud history of campaigns. The Ninth Legion, the legion called Hispana, had been in Britain from the early days of the conquest. It had fought in the great revolt of the British Queen Boudica. It had marched and built and bled across the island for decades, and its presence is recorded in inscriptions and in the standard Roman way, in the north of England, where for a time it was based at the fortress of York. And then, in the record, the Ninth Legion grows quiet. The inscriptions that name it in Britain seem to stop, and after a certain point in the 2nd century, the legion simply is not heard of again in the way the other legions are heard of. It does not appear in the later lists of the legions of the Roman army. It is, as far as the surviving record is concerned, gone, and into that silence, that gap in the paperwork of an empire, has poured one of the most romantic and persistent legends in British history. The story that grew up and that has been told in novels and in films and around a great many firesides is that the Ninth Legion marched north up into the unconquered country of what is now Scotland to deal with the fierce tribes of the far north, and that it never came back, that it was swallowed, that thousands of Roman soldiers walked into the mist and the hills of the north and were destroyed, ambushed and annihilated by the painted tribes, wiped from the earth so completely that even their eagle standard, the sacred symbol of the legion, was lost, and that the embarrassment of the disaster was so great that Rome quietly struck the legion from its memory and never spoke of it again. It is a wonderful story. It has the cold hills, the lost eagle, the vanished thousands, the silence of an empire too ashamed to speak. And the careful historians will tell you, gently, that it is probably not what happened. There is evidence, fragments of it, that the Ninth Legion still existed after its supposed disappearance in Britain. An inscription far away on the European mainland that seems to show the Legion, or a part of it, building elsewhere in the empire long after it had left York. The most likely sober explanation is that the Ninth Legion was simply transferred, posted away from Britain to serve somewhere else, as legions often were, and that it met its end, whatever its end was, far from the British hills, perhaps destroyed in some other war on some other frontier, in the east, where Rome lost legions too. The mystery, in other words, may be a mystery only because the records are patchy, because an empire's filing was never as complete as we wish it had been. But here is the honest truth at the bottom of it. We still do not actually know what became of the Ninth Legion. We do not know how it ended, or where, or when. The sober explanation is a balance of probabilities, not a proven fact, and the dramatic one has never been completely killed. Somewhere, in some year, in some place, the proud ninth came to an end, and the manner of that ending is genuinely lost, and so the legion goes on, marching, in the imagination, up into the northern mist, because we have never been given the right to call it safely home. Not all the Roman mysteries are so grand. Some of them are small enough to hold in one hand, and one of them, in particular, has been quietly driving people to distraction for the better part of 200 years. It is a small object, a few centimeters across, made of bronze, and it has been found scattered across the northwestern provinces of the old Roman Empire, including, quite a number of times, in Britain. It is called a Roman dodecahedron. A dodecahedron is a shape with 12 flat faces, each of them a pentagon, and a Roman dodecahedron is a hollow bronze object of that shape, and every one of its 12 faces has a round hole cut into it, and the holes are of different sizes, and at each of the corners, where the faces meet, there is a small round knob. They are carefully and rather beautifully made. There are dozens of them in museums, and nobody, in 2 centuries of looking at them, has ever been able to say, for certain, what they were for. This is the strange thing about the Roman dodecahedron. The Romans wrote a great deal. They wrote about their army, and their building, and their farming, and their cooking, and their gods, and their plumbing. And in all of that surviving Roman writing, there is not one single mention of this object, not one description, not one instruction, not one passing reference that anyone has ever securely identified. An object made carefully, in numbers, across a wide area, and the literate civilization that made it, never once, as far as we know, wrote it down. The suggestions for what it might be are many, and some of them are ingenious, and none of them has ever won general agreement. It has been called a measuring instrument, a device for ranging or surveying. It has been called an astronomical tool, something for judging the angle of the sun or working out a date for the planting of crops by sighting through the different-sized holes. It has been called a candle holder because one was found with wax inside it. It has been called a knitting tool, a frame for making the fingers of gloves, the different holes giving different sizes. It has been called a child's toy, a gaming piece, a rich person's expensive ornament, a religious object, a lucky charm, something carried by soldiers, something used by priests. The plain fact is that the Roman dodecahedron is a solved problem in no one's hands. It is a small bronze riddle, sitting in its museum case, and the civilization that could tell us the answer in a single sentence has been silent on the matter for 1600 years and shows no sign of breaking that silence now. If the dodecahedron is a Roman mystery made of silence, there is a place in the north of England that is the opposite, a place where the Romans speak to us directly, in their own voices, about the smallest and most human things, and it is one of the most precious sites in all of British archaeology. It is a fort called Vindolanda, and it lies just south of the Great Line of Hadrian's Wall, that astonishing barrier of stone that the Romans threw right across the neck of Britain from coast to coast. Vindolanda was a fort, like many others, garrisoned for centuries, and it has the great good fortune to sit on wet, oxygen-starved ground, the same kind of preserving wet that kept Stonehenge and Moss Farm and Lindo Man. And so at Vindolanda, in the waterlogged earth, the most fragile things have survived. Leather shoes, hundreds upon hundreds of them, the shoes of soldiers and women and children, wooden objects, textiles, and, most wonderful of all, writing, thin slivers of wood, postcard-sized, on which the people of the fort wrote letters in ink and threw away, and which the wet ground kept. The Vindolanda writing tablets are not the grand official record of an empire. They are the daily life of a frontier fort, written by the people who lived it, and to read them is to have the distance of nearly 2,000 years simply fall away. There are duty rosters and supply lists. There is a report on the local British fighters, slightly contemptuous in tone. There is a soldier writing home to ask, a little plaintively, for someone to send him more socks and more underwear because the British weather is what it is. And there is one tablet, more famous than all the rest, on which a woman named Claudia Severa, the wife of one commander, writes to another woman, her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the commander at Vindolanda, to invite her to come and celebrate her birthday, and she calls her friend the dearest of souls, and tells her how much she longs to see her. It is a birthday party invitation, written by one woman to another, on the cold northern edge of the Roman Empire, nearly 2,000 years ago. The mystery of Vindolanda is not a mystery of the unexplained. It is the opposite, and in its way, it is just as moving. It is the mystery of how close the ancient dead really are, how the same small warmths and worries ran through them as run through us. How a woman wanting her friend at her birthday is exactly, across all that time, a woman wanting her friend at her birthday, and how very thin and how very accidental is the wet patch of ground that let us hear her when all the rest of that vast and talkative empire has gone. For us, almost entirely quiet. And then the Romans left. After nearly 4 centuries, with the wider empire under growing strain, the soldiers and the administration of Rome were withdrawn from Britain, and the island was in effect told that it must now look after itself. And what happened next is one of the largest and darkest mysteries of the whole British past, because what happened next was that the lights, in a sense, went out. The Roman way of life in Britain, the towns, the coinage, the pottery industries, the villas with their heated floors, the writing, the whole bright, complicated machine of it, did not gently evolve into something else. Over a few generations, it collapsed. The towns emptied. The making of coins and fine pottery on a large scale simply stopped. The grand houses fell into ruin, and people lived, sometimes, in their crumbling shells and lit fires on their fine mosaic floors. Britain went, with startling speed, from a literate, urban, moneyed Roman province to a land of small timber settlements, a place that once again left almost no written record of itself, and slid into the long stretch of time that older books used to call, with a shiver, the Dark Ages. Dark above all, because we can see so little in it. How and why the Roman world in Britain came apart so completely and so fast, far more completely than in many other former Roman lands, is argued over still. Plague and the breakdown of trade and the arrival of new peoples and the simple withdrawal of the thing that had held it all together, all playing their part. But the deep strangeness of it remains. An island can be brought into the light of history and made to read and write and build in stone and trade across a continent. And then, in the space of a few lifetimes, it can fall most of the way back into silence, and the people living among the ruins of the towns can forget, within a few generations, what the towns had even been, and begin to tell themselves that the great stone buildings around them must have been raised long ago by giants, while the Roman south of Britain rose and shone and then fell back into silence. The far north of the island, the country beyond the walls, the land the Romans never truly held, was living a history of its own, and it is a history full of some of the most tantalizing mysteries of all, because the people of the north left us a great deal that we can see and almost nothing that we can read. The people who lived in the north and the east of what is now Scotland, in the centuries after the Romans came, and during the long years after they left, are known to us as the Picts. And the name itself is a small mystery to begin with, because it is not their name for themselves. It is a name the Romans used, a Latin word meaning the painted ones or the tattooed ones, and it carries with it a Roman idea, the idea of a wild people beyond the frontier who marked their skin. What the Picts called themselves in their own tongue, we do not securely know. The Picts were not, as the old stories sometimes had it, a strange, mysterious, vanished race, utterly unlike everyone around them. They were, in the main, the descendants of the older Iron Age peoples of northern Britain, the people who had always lived there, carrying on and developing in the land beyond Roman control. They farmed, they fought, they formed kingdoms. They had kings whose names we partly know from later lists, and in time, most of them became Christian. In that sense, they are not mysterious at all. But they did two things, or left two kinds of thing, that have kept them wrapped in genuine and unsolved mystery, and the first of those things is their stones. Across the north and east of Scotland, in fields and churchyards and on hillsides, there stand a number of carved stones, and the carving on them is unlike anything else in early medieval Britain. The Picts took slabs of stone and covered them with images, beautifully and confidently cut, and some of those images are things we can understand, animals rendered with real skill and life, a bull, an eagle, a wolf, a salmon, a stag, and human figures, warriors on horseback, hunting scenes, and after the Picts became Christian, the cross, worked into ever more elaborate and gorgeous designs. But mixed in among these readable pictures, on stone after stone after stone, there is a set of other symbols, and these other symbols are the mystery. They are abstract shapes, and they recur again and again across the whole Pictish country, clearly a fixed set, clearly meaningful, clearly understood by everyone who used them. There is a shape often called the crescent and V-rod, a crescent crossed by a bent and decorated line. There is a shape called the double disc and Z-rod, two circles joined and crossed by another bent line. There is a strange creature, drawn over and over, that is not any real animal, a beast with a long snout and curling limbs, and scholars, unable to name it, simply call it the Pictish beast. There are mirrors, combs, geometric forms, a whole vocabulary of them, and nobody knows what they mean. This is a true and total mystery, sitting out in the open in the fields of Scotland. The Pictish symbols are not random decoration. They are too consistent for that, too carefully repeated, too clearly a system. They appear to mean something specific. They may be names, the names of individual people, or of families, or of kindreds, so that a stone carved with certain symbols is, in effect, a statement of who, a marker of identity, or of lineage, or of a marriage between two lines. They may record rank or office. They may be connected with land, with ownership, with the dead, with alliances. Some scholars have studied them, almost as one would study an undeciphered script, looking at how often particular symbols appear, in what combinations, in what order, hunting for the grammar of them. But the Picts did not leave us a key. They did not leave us a single stone where the symbols sit beside a translation. They left us the system, perfect and complete, and used for centuries, and they took the meaning of it with them. And so the carved stones of the Picts stand in the rain in their churchyards, immaculately cut, perfectly preserved in many cases, and perfectly silent, a message in a language of shapes that was never written down in words, addressed to everyone who passes and legible to no one alive. The deeper layer of the Pictish mystery is the language itself. The Picts spoke, and we know they spoke, and we even have a scattering of Pictish words that survive, mostly the names of places and the names of people, caught and preserved in the writings of their neighbours. And from those scraps, the careful study of language suggests that the Picts spoke a tongue related to the other ancient Celtic languages of Britain, a cousin of the early forms of Welsh, not some isolated, unknowable speech, but a member of a known family. And yet, we have no Pictish literature, no Pictish books, no long Pictish text of any kind, nothing in their own language written down at any length by their own hands. We have a people who lived for centuries, who built kingdoms, who carved like angels, and whose actual spoken voice survives only as a handful of place names and a few proper names embedded in other people's records, like a few shells from a vanished sea. And then, the Picts, as a distinct people with a distinct identity, ended. In the 9th century and after, the kingdom of the Picts and the kingdom of the Scots. The Gaelic-speaking people who had come to the western coast were drawn together, merged by conquest and marriage and the slow pressure of events, into a single new kingdom, the kingdom that would become Scotland. And in the centuries that followed, the separate Pictish identity dissolved. The Pictish language was given up, replaced by Gaelic, and then largely forgotten. The carving of the symbol stones stopped. Within a few generations, the Picts had become, even to their own descendants, a half-legendary people of the past, and folk tales grew up that the Picts had been tiny, that they had built their structures by passing the stones hand to hand in a long human chain, that they had brewed a wonderful ale from heather, whose secret they carried, every last one of them, into the grave rather than reveal. The Picts did not vanish in the way the legends say. Their blood ran on in the people of Scotland, then as now. But their language vanished, and their symbols fell silent, and their name for themselves was lost. And so, a whole people slipped out of memory and into mystery, while their descendants were still farming the same fields. The Picts and the older northern peoples before them also left, scattered across the Scottish landscape. Two kinds of structure that carry their own quieter puzzles, and they are worth a moment in the dark. The first is the broch. A broch is a tower, a round tower of dry stone, built without mortar, with immensely thick walls. And the cleverness of a broch is that its walls are hollow, built as two skins of stone, with a space and a staircase running up between them, so that the tower could rise high while staying stable. The brochs are found above all in the far north and the islands of Scotland, and there are a great many of them, and the best preserved still stand to a remarkable height, perfect circles of fitted stone rising out of the turf. And the gentle mystery of the brochs is what, exactly, they were for. They look like fortresses, strong and high and defensible, places to shelter from a raid. But many of them stand in places that make poor military sense. And they may have been, as much as anything, statements. The high stone houses of important families, built tall and fine and impressive, because height and fineness said something about the people inside, a way of being seen and of being secure at the same time. Fort, farmhouse, status symbol, refuge. The broch is probably all of these woven together, and the balance of it, the real reason a community would pour such labour into raising a tower, shifts with every scholar who writes about it. The second northern structure is stranger and more secretive, and it is called the souterrain, which simply means an underground place. A souterrain is a passage, dug down into the earth and lined and roofed with stone, a curving underground gallery attached to an ordinary settlement of ordinary houses. The people lived their lives above ground, in the daylight, and beside or beneath their homes, they had these long, dark, stone-lined tunnels going down into the cool of the earth. In Cornwall, far to the south, there are very similar underground structures where they are called by an old Cornish word, fogus. And the mystery of the souterrain and the fogu is simply, again, what were they for? The most ordinary and most likely answer is storage, that the cool, stable damp of an underground passage was an excellent place to keep food, to keep dairy produce or grain or meat through the warm months. An ancient larder dug into the ground. But the souterrains and fogus have a way of feeling like more than larders. They took real effort to build. Some of them are carefully made, even elegant, and so it has always been wondered whether they were also, or instead, places of refuge, somewhere to hide people or valuables when danger came over the hill, or whether they had a meaning beyond the practical, whether going down into the dark earth and coming back up again was for these people an act with some weight to it, some ritual sense, a small descent into the underworld and a return. We do not know. We have the cool, dark curving passages, and we can stand in them, and the earth presses close, and the people who dug them knew exactly why they wanted a way down into the ground, and that knowledge, like so much on this long night's walk, has soaked away into the soil and left us only the shape of the question. Let us come south once more, down into England again, into the centuries after the Romans had gone, the centuries when new peoples were settling the land, and the old Roman towns were crumbling, and Britain was being remade into something that would, much later, be called England. These are the centuries that used to be called dark, and they were dark, in the sense that very little written light falls on them. And out of that darkness, in the 1930s, on a quiet estate in Suffolk, there rose one of the most spectacular discoveries ever made on British soil, and at the heart of it, there lay a mystery in the most literal possible form, an empty space where a body should have been. The place is called Sutton Hoo, and it's a group of grassy mounds on a bluff above a river in Suffolk, the kind of low, rounded mounds that the British landscape is full of, the kind that the eye slides over. The landowner, curious about what the mounds on her property might contain, brought in a local archaeologist to dig, and in the largest of the mounds he found something that took the breath away. He found the ghost of a ship. The ship itself, a great rowing ship some 27 meters long, had been built of timber, and the timber had long since rotted entirely away in the acid Suffolk soil. But the ship had been fastened together with hundreds of iron rivets, and the rivets had survived, holding their positions, and the planks of the ship had left their shape stained dark into the sand. So what the excavators uncovered was not a ship, but the perfect impression of one, a full-sized ship printed into the earth, every line of it a vessel made of nothing but stain and rivet and the careful reading of the sand. A great ship, dragged up from the river and buried whole under a mound of earth, is already an extraordinary thing. But it was what lay in the middle of the ship that made Sutton Hoo one of the wonders of Europe. There, where a burial chamber had been built amidships, the diggers found a treasure. They found a helmet, an iron helmet faced with decorated panels and given a full face mask, a stern and beautiful and slightly eerie iron face, which has become one of the most famous objects in all of British archaeology. The face, for many people, of the whole early medieval age. They found a great gold belt buckle, heavy and intricate, its surface a maze of interlacing, writhing animal forms. They found shoulder clasps of gold and garnet, made with a jeweler's skill so fine it is hard to believe the eyes and hands that did it. They found a sword with a gold and garnet hilt, and a shield, and spears, and a strange iron stand, and a sceptre, a great whetstone carved with faces and topped with a bronze stag, a thing that can only have been a symbol of rule. They found silver bowls and a great silver dish that had come all the way from the eastern Mediterranean, from the Byzantine world. They found drinking horns and the fittings of a lyre, and coins, gold coins from across the sea in Frankish Gaul. It was the burial of someone enormously powerful, someone royal, a king or a man very close to a king, sent into the earth in a ship with everything a great lord could need, in a style of burial that reaches straight back into the old pagan world of the north, the world of the sagas, the world of treasure and ships and warrior kings. And here is the mystery, the strange, hollow center of all that gold. In the burial chamber, surrounded by the treasure, there was no body. There was no skeleton laid out among the riches, no bones, nothing. For a long time it was thought that the burial had simply never contained a body at all, that it was an empty memorial, a cenotaph, a grave raised in honor of a king whose actual body lay elsewhere, lost, perhaps drowned at sea, perhaps fallen far away. Later study suggested a different and quieter answer, that there had been a body after all, laid among the treasure, but that the particular chemistry of that sandy acid soil had been so aggressive that it had dissolved the body completely, bone and all, leaving no trace whatsoever, the way it had dissolved the timbers of the ship. So the king of Sutton Hoo may be there still, in a sense, present as an absence, his outline long since gone even from the stain in the sand. And the deeper question, the one that has never been settled, is who he was. The wealth of the burial, the date of those Frankish coins, the sheer scale and royalty of it, all point toward the kings of the East Angles, the ruling line of that corner of England, and one name comes up more than any other, the name of a powerful king called Raedwald, who ruled around the right time and was, by the standards of the age, a great man, a king who held sway over other kings. It may be Raedwald lying in the ship under the mound. It may be another king of his line, but it cannot be proven, and so the most magnificent burial ever found in England is also, fittingly, a grave we cannot put a name to, a king without a body and a body without a name, a face of iron staring up out of the Suffolk sand on behalf of someone whose own face is gone past all recovering. If Sutton Hoo is a mystery of a king we can almost name, there is a figure from these same shadowed centuries whom we cannot name at all, and yet whose name everyone knows, and that is the strange position of King Arthur. There is no figure in the British imagination larger than Arthur, the once and future king, with his round table and his knights and his sword and his queen and his wizard and his last barge, sailing into the mist toward the island of Avalon. The stories of Arthur have been told and retold for the better part of 1,000 years, growing richer and longer and more magical with every century. And the mystery of Arthur is this: underneath that vast and glittering mountain of story, was there ever a real man? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that the question is genuinely, perhaps permanently, unanswerable. If there was a real Arthur, he would have lived in those darkest of the post-Roman centuries, the 5th or 6th century, in the chaotic time after Rome's withdrawal, when the Romanized Britons were struggling against the incoming Saxons. He would have been not a medieval king in armor, for that whole world came centuries later, but a war leader of the sub-Roman Britons, a commander perhaps, who for a while held the invaders back. And the trouble is that the sources for that time are almost nothing. The very earliest writings that mention the wars of that period are few and thin, and were written down well after the events, and the earliest of them do not even mention Arthur by name at all. He appears, named, only in later texts, and the gap between the time he supposedly lived and the time he is first clearly written about is wide enough to drive every doubt in the world through. So there are serious scholars who think there was a real war leader, perhaps even one really called something like Arthur, around whom the stories later gathered. And there are equally serious scholars who think Arthur was never a man at all, but began as a legend, a hero, a figure of story and longing, and was only later mistaken for history. The thing cannot be settled. The evidence to settle it does not exist, and almost certainly never will. There is one place, though, where the legend of Arthur and the real archaeology of those centuries brush up against each other, and it is a dramatic place, and it deepens the mystery in a wonderful way rather than solving it. On the north coast of Cornwall, on a wild headland battered by the Atlantic, there stand the ruins of a castle called Tintagel. The castle whose ruins you see there today is medieval, built long after any possible Arthur, built, in fact, partly because of the Arthur legend, by a medieval earl who wanted to own the romantic place where the stories said Arthur had been conceived. So the castle itself is not Arthur's. But when archaeologists dug on that headland, they found that long before the medieval castle, back in exactly those shadowy post-Roman centuries when an Arthur might have lived, Tintagel had been something remarkable. It had been an important high-status settlement, a place of substantial buildings on the windswept rock, and crucially, the diggers found there great quantities of fine pottery and glass that had come from far away, from the Mediterranean, from the Eastern Roman world, vessels that had once held wine and oil and been carried by ship across thousands of miles of sea. Tintagel, in the time of the possible Arthur, was a place plugged into long-distance trade, a seat of wealth and power and reach. Very probably a stronghold of the rulers of that part of post-Roman Britain. And on the site there was even found a piece of stone with an inscription scratched into it, bearing a name that some, in the first excitement, read as a form close to Arthur, though calmer study showed it was a different name and no real link to the legend at all. So Tintagel does not give us Arthur. It gives us something stranger and truer. It gives us proof that the dark centuries were not as dark or as poor or as cut off as we imagined, that there really were powerful British rulers in the West, holding rich wind-blown strongholds and trading with the far Mediterranean, that the raw material of legend, the kings and the strongholds and the lost glory, was genuinely there. Whether one of those rulers was a man called Arthur, the headland will not say. The sea comes in against the rock the way it always has, and the legend and the history stand side by side on the cliff, close enough to touch and never quite meeting. There is one more great mystery to walk through tonight, and it is the largest of them all, larger than Stonehenge, larger than any single monument, because it is not an object at all. It is a country. It is a whole lost country, and it does not lie under the soil of Britain, but under the cold grey water of the North Sea. And once, not so very long ago in the long reckoning of these things, people lived there and walked its rivers and hunted in its forests and called it home. And then the sea rose, slowly and patiently, and took it, and it has been gone for thousands of years, and we have only recently begun to understand that it was ever there at all. The lost country has been given a name by the scientists who study it, and the name is Doggerland. To understand it, you have to go back to the end of the last great ice age, more than 10,000 years ago, and you have to let go of the map of Europe that you carry in your head. Because that map, with Britain a separate island cut off from the continent by the sea, is a recent thing. For most of the time that people have lived in this part of the world, Britain was not an island at all. The sea level was far lower, because so much of the world's water was locked up in great ice sheets, and the floor of what is now the North Sea was dry land, a vast low-lying plain that joined the eastern side of Britain seamlessly onto the rest of Europe. You could have walked from the place that is now Yorkshire to the place that is now Denmark, and never once seen the sea, and never known you had crossed from one country to another, because there was no crossing and there were no countries, only one continuous land. And Doggerland, this drowned plain, was not a bleak or empty place. As the ice retreated and the climate warmed, it became, by all the evidence, rich country, perhaps the richest country in the whole region, a low green land of gentle hills and wide marshes and winding rivers, of woodland and reed beds and lakes, exactly the kind of landscape that teems with life. There would have been deer and wild cattle and wild pig in the forests, fish and eels in the rivers, birds in vast numbers in the wetlands, the rivers themselves full of the migrating runs of fish. For the hunting and gathering people of the Mesolithic, the people of Cheddarman's distant kin, Doggerland would not have been a frontier or a wilderness. It would have been a heartland, the best of the country, the place you would most want to be. And we know people were there because the evidence has been coming up for many years in the nets of fishing boats. The trawlers working the shallow part of the North Sea, the area the fishermen themselves call the Dogger Bank, have dragged up from the sea floor, along with the fish, the bones of land animals long extinct in Britain, the bones of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, and ancient deer, and, every so often, the work of human hands, worked flint tools, and barbed points carved from antler and bone, the hunting gear of the people of the drowned land, lying on the bottom of the sea, where it fell from the hands of a hunter 10,000 years ago. And then the water came. As the great ice sheets of the world melted away, all that water had to go somewhere, and where it went was into the sea, and the sea, everywhere in the world, began to rise. It did not rise as a wave or a flood. Not for the most part. It rose the way a tide rises, only far slower, a little each year, each generation finding the water a little higher than their parents had known it, the coastline creeping inland, the lowest ground turning first to marsh and then to lagoon and then to open sea. Over thousands of years, Doggerland drowned. The high ground became islands, and then the islands grew smaller, and then the islands too went under. And the people who lived there must have moved, generation by generation, retreating before the patient water onto the shrinking land, until at last there was no Doggerland left, only the North Sea, and Britain, for the first time, was an island, cut off, alone, the way we have always known it. There is a thought, and it's only a thought, that the drowning may not have been gentle all the way to the end. There is evidence that at one point a colossal underwater landslide off the coast of Norway sent a great tsunami sweeping across the North Sea, and if there were still people clinging to the last low remnants of Doggerland when that wave came, then their end may have been sudden and terrible. But mostly it was slow. Mostly it was simply the water, rising, year after year after year, and a homeland disappearing. Not in a day, but across 100 lifetimes, so slowly that no one alive ever saw it happen, and yet it happened completely. The mystery of Doggerland is not really a mystery of fact. We know now that it was there. We can map its old rivers and hills from the soundings of the seafloor. The mystery of Doggerland is a mystery of feeling, of imagination, of the sheer strangeness of it. It is the knowledge that there is an entire chapter of the human story, thousands of years of lives, of families, of hunts and meals and births and deaths and songs, that took place on land that no living person can ever stand on, that no one will ever excavate properly, that lies scattered and silent under the cold green water while the ferries and the container ships pass overhead. The people of Doggerland had no idea they were living in a doomed land. To them, it was simply the world, solid and permanent, the place their grandparents had hunted and their grandchildren would hunt. And it is all gone, the whole country, drowned and dark, and it lies there now under the North Sea, the largest of all the lost places of ancient Britain, a country with no name of its own that we will ever know, remembered only in the bones that come up in the fishing nets, sleeping under the water that took it. There are smaller mysteries, too, threaded all through the ancient British landscape, and some of them are easy to walk straight past, and one of them is written on the bare rock itself. Across the north of Britain in particular, on outcrops of stone, on the flat tops of boulders, on the surfaces of rocks on the open moor, the ancient people carved a strange and simple and haunting kind of mark. The mark is called, by archaeologists, cup and ring art. It is made of small round hollows pecked into the rock. The cups, and around many of the cups, rings, single or multiple, carved as concentric circles, and often a straight line or groove running out from the center of a cup. Through the rings, like a channel, like a path. There are thousands of these carvings, on hundreds of rocks, made across a very long stretch of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. They are not pictures of anything. They are not animals or people, or the sun or the moon. They are these abstract cups and rings and grooves, repeated with endless small variation, on rock after rock after rock, for thousands of years, and nobody knows what they mean. The cup and ring marks are one of the purest mysteries in all of British prehistory, because they are clearly deliberate, clearly meaningful, clearly important enough that people return to the practice for 100 generations, and they are completely abstract, offering the modern eye no handhold at all. They have been called maps, perhaps maps of the landscape, perhaps maps of the stars. They have been called markers, signs placed on the rock to mean here is a boundary, or here is a route, or here is a place where something may be done or must not be done. They have been tied to water because the carvings so often hold water when it rains, the cups filling, brimming, the rings catching the wet, and there is something in that, in the way the marks come alive when the rain falls. They have been called records of some belief, some cosmology, the ring standing for worlds within worlds, the channel a path between them. They have been linked to the burial of the dead, since cup-marked stones turn up built into ancient graves. They have even been thought of, more simply, as the marks of trance, the kind of pattern the human mind throws up in certain altered states, carved onto the rock as a way of fixing a vision. Any of these? None of these. The truth is that we stand in front of a cup and ring carving exactly as we stand in front of the Pictish symbols and the Roman dodecahedron, knowing for certain that it meant something specific and serious to the people who made it, and knowing equally for certain that the meaning is gone, dissolved out of the world, leaving only the marks themselves, holding the rain. Some of the ancient mysteries of Britain are enormous, the drowned countries and the great stone rings, and some of them are small enough to be held in two cupped hands, and there is a set of objects, only a handful of them in all the world, that belong to this smaller and very intimate kind of mystery, and they are carved out of solid chalk. The first three of them were found well over a century ago, in a child's grave under a round burial mound at a place called Folkestone in Yorkshire, and they have been known ever since as the Folkestone drums. They are not drums. They cannot be played, and they almost certainly never made a sound. They are simply called drums because that is roughly their shape. Three solid cylinders of chalk, like short squat barrels, of three slightly different sizes, and they had been placed in the grave of a young child, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, one set behind the child's head and the others near the body. What makes the Folkestone drums remarkable is that they are carved all over, with care and confidence and real artistry. their surfaces covered in panels of pattern and worked into the decoration of some of them. Faintly, there appear to be eyes, or the suggestion of a face, watching out from the chalk. They are among the finest pieces of decorative art to survive from Neolithic Britain, and they were made, or at least finally used, to be buried in the dark with a dead child. And then, only a few years ago, a fourth object of the same astonishing kind was found, far better preserved than the Folkestone Three, in another child's grave, this one near a village called Burton Agnes, not far away in the same part of Yorkshire. The Burton Agnes drum is carved with the same flowing, confident art, and it was buried, the dating showed, at almost exactly the same time as the buildings of the great Sarsen monument at Stonehenge, by people who shared, across the whole width of Britain, the same artistic language, the same patterns, the same ideas. Buried with the chalk drum at Burton Agnes were a small chalk ball and a polished bone pin, and the grave held the bodies of 3 children together, lying close. And the mystery of the chalk drums is a tender and difficult one, because we do not know what they were, and the not knowing presses right up against grief. They are not tools. They are not weapons. They had no practical use anyone has ever been able to suggest. They are objects made purely to carry meaning, beautiful and useless and deeply intentional, and they keep being found in the graves of children. They may be guardians, objects placed with a dead child to watch over them, to keep them company, to protect them on whatever journey the people believed the dead child was now making, and the faint eyes worked into the chalk would fit that idea. A watching thing set in the dark beside a small body. They may be tokens, treasured things that belong to the children in life, or that belong to their grieving families and were given up into the grave as the most precious thing the family had to give. There has even been a careful and ingenious suggestion that the 3 different sizes of the Folkestone drums are linked to measurement, that their proportions encode units of length used in laying out the great monuments, that they are, in some sense, the standards, the rulers of the people who built the stone circles, made sacred and made small and buried with a child. We cannot choose between these. We can only hold the objects in the mind, the carved chalk cylinders with their faint, patient eyes, made by loving and skillful hands 4,500 years ago and laid down in the earth beside children, and feel, very strongly and very uselessly, how much those people meant by it, and how completely the meaning has gone. Not every ancient mystery of Britain comes to us only through the spade and the scientist. Some of them come trailing a long tail of story, of folklore, of things the country people said for centuries about the strange old stones in their fields, and there is one stone circle in particular that gathered more story around itself than almost any other, and it sits quietly on a low ridge on the border of Oxfordshire and Warwickshire, and it is called the Rollright Stones. The Rollright Stones are not one monument but 3, set near each other, and they were built at different times across the long ages of prehistory. There is a circle of standing stones, weathered into strange, gnarled and pitted shapes by their thousands of years in the weather, and the circle is known as the King's Men. There is a single tall stone, standing apart, leaning, on the other side of the road called the King's Stone. And there is a little huddle of stones, the remains of the burial chamber, of a long-vanished tomb, known as the Whispering Knights. What is wonderful and strange about the Rollright Stones is the story that the names belong to, a story told in that countryside for hundreds of years, long after the true purpose of the stones had been entirely forgotten. The story says that once a king came marching across the land with his army, intending to conquer all of England, and that on this ridge he met a witch. And the witch told him that if he could take 7 long strides and see the village of Long Compton in the valley below, then he would indeed be king of all England. And the king, full of confidence, took his 7 great strides, but as he stepped, a long mound of earth rose up before him and blocked his view, and he could not see the village, and so the witch's spell took him, And she turned him to stone where he stood, and that is the king's stone, leaning alone by the road forever. And she turned his soldiers to stone too, and they are the king's men, the circle of them caught mid-march. And a little way off, some of his knights had drawn aside to mutter and plot treason against him. And them she turned to stone as well, frozen in the act of whispering. And they are the whispering knights. And the witch herself, the story says, became an elder tree, standing nearby, so that she could keep watch over the stones forever. It is, of course, not what happened. The stones are far older than any king of England, older than England itself, raised by the ancient people for their own forgotten reasons. But the folk story is itself a kind of fossil, and a precious one, and that is the real point of the Rollright stones. The story shows us what happens when a people lose the true meaning of an ancient place. The meaning does not stay empty, it fills back up, with story, with a tale that explains the shapes and the names, that turns a worn stone circle into an army caught in a spell. And the Rollright stones gathered more than that one tale. It was said that the stones could not be counted, that no two people would ever arrive at the same number, that anyone who tried would fail. It was said that the king's men went down the hill at certain times to drink from a spring. It was said that the whispering knights still whispered, and that a girl who wished to know her future could press her ear to them and hear it. It was said to be dangerous, deeply unlucky, to break a piece off the stones or to move them. These stories are not history, but they are a true record of something, a record of the long centuries when the ancient monuments stood in the landscape stripped of their real meaning, regarded by the people who lived among them, with a mixture of awe and unease and superstition, felt to be powerful and uncanny and not to be meddled with, even though no one any longer had the faintest idea why they were there. The folklore is the sound of a culture remembering that a thing mattered long after it has forgotten what the thing was. There is one more kind of ancient place that deserves a moment before this long night begins to draw toward its close, and it is a kind so common across Britain that, like the cup and ring marks, the eye learns to slide past it. It is the round barrow, the burial mound, the rounded green hump in the field or on the skyline, and there are thousands upon thousands of them across the country. Many of them belong to the early Bronze Age, the time of the Beaker people and those who came after, the centuries around and after the raising of the great stones at Stonehenge, and they were built to cover the dead, sometimes a single important person, sometimes more, the body or the burnt bones placed in the ground, and the mound raised carefully over them, a permanent green monument to one human life. Most of them, when they have been opened, hold a simple burial, a person and perhaps a pot, perhaps a few small things, but some of them, particularly the barrows clustered in the rich country around Stonehenge, have held something far more dazzling and have given that period its name, the time of the Wessex chieftains, the lords of the early Bronze Age. The greatest of these is a barrow called Bush Barrow, which stands within sight of Stonehenge itself, and when it was opened, long ago, it was found to contain the burial of a powerful man laid out with extraordinary wealth. There were daggers, their hilts once decorated with many thousands of tiny gold pins, each one finer than a hair, set into the wood in patterns, a labour of almost unimaginable patience and delicacy. There was a large lozenge of sheet gold, finely engraved, that had lain on the man's chest. There was a second smaller gold lozenge, and a gold belt fitting, and a stone mace head, the head of a ceremonial weapon, with what seemed to have been decorated bone mounts for its wooden handle. Here was a person, buried beside the greatest monument in Britain, sent into the earth as a figure of immense importance, dressed in gold, armed with beautiful weapons, honoured beyond almost anyone else of his age. And we do not know who he was. We do not know his name, or what he ruled, or what he had done, or whether the gold lozenge on his chest was a badge of kingship or of priesthood, or of something we have no word for. We do not know his relationship to the great stones he was buried beside, whether he was their guardian, their ruler, their priest, their descendant, or simply a powerful man who wished, as so many did, to lie for eternity in their shadow. The barrows around Stonehenge are full of these people, the gold-wearing dead of the early Bronze Age, and every one of them was, in life, a person of weight and consequence, someone whose name would have been known, the length of the land, and every single one of them is now exactly as anonymous as the poorest beggar of their age. Their names gone, their deeds gone, their very faces gone, leaving only the gold, and the green mound, and the silence, and the great stones standing nearby, keeping their own much older secret over all of them. Before we let this night drift toward its end, there are two more places to visit, and they take us back to the very oldest layers of the human story in Britain, back before the stone circles, before the long barrows, before farming itself, into the deep time of the hunters, and they are both places where the wet ground has kept something it had no business keeping. The first lies in Yorkshire, beside what was once the shore of an ancient lake, long since silted up and turned to peat and farmland, and it is called Starcar. People camped at Starcar around 11,000 years ago, in the centuries soon after the last ice had loosened its grip on Britain, and they are some of the earliest people we can see clearly in the whole of the island's history, a small community of hunters living on the edge of a lake in a newly green and recovering land. Starcar should, by every ordinary rule, have left us nothing. 11,000 years is deep, deep time, and the people who camped there had no metal and no pottery and built nothing in stone. But the peat that formed over the old lake shore preserved their traces with a tenderness that is almost unbearable. And so from Starcar we have things that simply do not survive from anywhere else of that age in Britain. We have worked wood, including what appears to be a wooden platform built out over the wet ground at the lake edge, possibly the oldest known carpentry in Britain. We have tools of antler and bone in great numbers, and we have, from Starcar, the strangest and most haunting objects of all, the things known as the antler frontlets. These were made from the skulls of red deer stags, with the antlers still attached. The ancient people took the upper part of the skull and the antlers, and they worked them, thinned the bone, smoothed it, and pierced holes through it, holes that could have held a strap or a cord. More than 20 of these antler headdresses have been found at Starcar, far more than at any other site in Europe. And the question, of course, is what they were for. And the question opens, as all these questions open, onto darkness. The piercing of the holes suggests strongly that the frontlets were meant to be worn, fastened onto a human head, so that a person could put on the skull and antlers of a stag and become, in some sense, half deer. They may have been a hunter's disguise, a way of getting close to the deer herds by looking, at a distance, like one of them, a piece of pure cold practicality. But more than 20 of them, made with such care, has made many who study them feel that practicality is not the whole of it, or even the main of it. They may have been worn in ceremony, in dance, in ritual. A person who put on the antlers of a stag may have been doing something far larger than disguise, may have been becoming the deer, taking on its spirit, crossing, for the length of a rite, the line between the human and the animal, in a world where that line was perhaps not drawn the firm hard way. We draw it now. We are looking, at Starcar, at what may be the oldest evidence of ritual, of religion, of the human reaching toward the unseen, in the whole of British history, and it comes to us as a worked deer skull with 2 holes punched through it, and we will never see the dance, or hear the words, or know the belief, only the antlers, kept in the peat for 11,000 years, waiting. The second of these deep places lies far to the southwest, in the flat, watery country of the Somerset Levels, and it is not a monument or a camp, but a road. Around 6,000 years ago, in the time of the earliest farmers, the people of that area faced a practical problem. They needed to cross a stretch of treacherous, reedy swamp, wet ground that could not be safely walked, to get from one piece of dry land to another. And their answer to that problem has survived, buried under the peat, and it is called the Sweet Track, after the man who found it, and it is one of the oldest engineered roads known anywhere in the world. The Sweet Track was a raised wooden walkway, almost 2 kilometers long, built to carry people single file across the swamp, dry shod above the water. And the people who built it were not fumbling. They built it with real skill and real planning. They laid long rails of timber along the ground and pegged them in place with sharpened stakes driven down at an angle, crossing each other, and into the V-shaped cradle made by the crossing stakes they set a raised walkway of planks. The tree rings in the timber are so well preserved that we know the trees were felled across a very short span, and the most likely reading is that the whole 2 kilometers of the Sweet Track was built in a single year, perhaps even in a single season, by a community that knew exactly what it was doing, planned the work, gathered the wood, and laid the road. The Sweet Track is not a mystery of the baffling kind. We know what it was for. It was for crossing the swamp. But it is a mystery of a gentler and more correcting kind, because it quietly demolishes an idea that many people still carry about the deep past. The idea that the further back you go, the cruder and the simpler and the more helpless people must have been. The Sweet Track was built 6,000 years ago by people we might be tempted to call primitive, and it is a piece of confident, skilled, well-planned civil engineering, a designed structure built to a purpose by people who understood timber and understood their landscape and understood how to organize a community's labor to solve a problem. And there is one more small thing about the Sweet Track that lingers. Along its length, in the mud beside it, people have found objects, including a beautiful polished axe head made of green jade, a stone that had been carried an immense distance from the high Alps of Europe, an object far too fine and too precious to have been a working tool, an object that seems to have been laid down beside the track deliberately, given to the wet ground, an offering. So even here, on a plain, practical wooden road across a swamp, the ancient British did the thing they so often did, and gave something beautiful to the water, for reasons that were perfectly clear to them and are closed to us, and the greened jade axe lay in the peat beside the road for 6,000 years until it was found. There is one more kind of place we should walk to before the night closes over us, and it is a place built not for the dead and not for the gods, but for the living and for fear. In the county of Dorset, in the south of England, there rises out of the farmland a hill that does not look quite like an ordinary hill. Its sides are too regular. They are wrapped, ring upon ring, in a series of vast, curving banks and ditches, layer behind layer, like the contour lines on a map made solid and enormous, and from the air, the whole thing looks like a great green ship run aground in the fields, or like something a giant might have moulded out of the earth with slow, circling hands. This is Maiden Castle, and it is one of the largest and most spectacular hill forts in the whole of Europe, and walking its ramparts in the dark is a way of standing inside the worry of people who lived more than 2,000 years ago. Maiden Castle began modestly. In the time of the early farmers, long before the great ramparts, there was a simple enclosure on the eastern end of the hill, a single bank and ditch, and for a long while the hilltop was quiet. Then, in the Iron Age, in the centuries before the Romans came, the people of that part of Dorset returned to the hill and began to build, and they did not stop for a long time. They threw up the first ring of bank and ditch around the hilltop, enclosing a space large enough to hold a small town. And then, as the years passed and the worry grew, they did not feel that one ring was enough. They dug again, further out and further down, piling the chalk into a second great rampart, and then a third, so that anyone approaching the settlement on the hill would have to climb and descend, through a sequence of steep white walls and deep ditches, each one a barrier, each one a place where a defender stood above and an attacker struggled below. At its height, the inner rampart and the bottom of the outer ditch were separated by a fall of many meters of bare chalk, a slope so steep and so deliberately engineered that it would exhaust an enemy long before a single blow was struck. And the gateways, the entrances through these rings, were not simple gaps. They were deliberately made complicated and confusing, twisting passages that doubled back on themselves, so that anyone coming in had to follow a long, curving corridor, always overlooked, always within reach of the people standing on the banks above, always slowed, always exposed. The whole hill was turned, over generations, into a single enormous machine for the purpose of making attack difficult and defense easy. And the amount of labor folded into those banks is staggering. The patient moving of a mountain of chalk by hand, basket by basket, by a community that had decided this work was worth doing, that the danger was real enough, or felt real enough, to be worth the years. Inside the rings, on the broad protected top of the hill, people lived. Archaeologists have found the round houses, the storage pits dug into the chalk to keep grain through the winter, the patient ordinary signs of a settled community going about its life, growing its food, keeping its animals, raising its children, all of it inside the great curving walls. And that is the thing that lingers about Maiden Castle when you stand on it in the dark. It was a town built inside a fortress, a place where daily life and deep fear were folded together, where children grew up knowing the walls the way a modern child knows the streets, where the act of coming home meant climbing through ring after ring of defense. We do not fully know what they were afraid of. We do not have their voices. We do not know whether the great ramparts were thrown up against a real and constant threat of raiding and war, or whether they were also, in part, a display, a way for the community and its leaders to show their strength and their wealth and their ability to command labor. A thing built as much for pride and for the eye as for the spear. Probably it was both, the way such things usually are, defense and statement at once. What we do know is how it ended, or at least how one chapter of it ended, because Maiden Castle had the bad fortune to still be a living, occupied stronghold when the Roman army came to Britain. And the Roman conquest was not gentle. The great fortress on the hill, with all its rings and all its labor, belonged to a world of warfare that the disciplined Roman war machine simply did not play by. Excavations near one of the gateways uncovered a cemetery of hurried burials, men and women laid in the ground in a short span of time, and some of the bodies carry the marks of violence, cuts and blade wounds to the bone, and in one famous case, a piece of iron, an arrowhead or a bolt head, lodged in a human spine. For a long time this was told as a clean dramatic story. The storming of Maiden Castle, the Roman assault, the massacre at the gate, and more recent and more careful work has made the picture less certain and less tidy, as careful work usually does. The cemetery may record a single battle, or it may record a more drawn-out and complicated period of trouble. But the broad shape of it remains, and it is a somber shape. The greatest hill fort in the land, the hill wrapped in its rings of fear, was overtaken in the end, and the people who had built and trusted those walls were buried in haste. Beside the gate they could no longer hold, and not long after, the Romans moved the population down off the hill into a new town on the flat ground, a Roman town, ordered and open, and the great green fortress was left to the grass and the sheep and the wind, which have had it ever since. We will walk to one last place, and it lies far to the west, on the high wild moorland of Dartmoor, in Devon, a landscape of granite and bog and weather. And the mystery there is one of the strangest and the quietest of all, because it is a mystery of lines. Scattered across Dartmoor, half hidden in the heather, there are rows of standing stones. Not circles this time, but rows, single files of stones set upright in the earth, marching across the moor in long, straight, or gently curving lines. Some of the rows are short, a modest line of low stones you might step over without noticing. Others are extraordinary. The longest of them, on a stretch of moor called Stall Moor and running on to Green Hill, is more than 3 kilometres in length, an unbroken line of stones running over the contours of the land for mile after mile, and it is thought to be the longest prehistoric stone row anywhere in the world, and no one knows what the rows are for. They were set up in the Bronze Age, several thousand years ago, by the people who farmed and herded on the moor when its climate was kinder than it is now, and those people left the rows scattered everywhere across the high ground, sometimes single, sometimes in pairs of parallel lines, sometimes in threes. Very often, a stone row begins or ends at a burial, at a cairn or a small ring of stones with a grave at its heart. So the rows are tangled up somehow with the dead, and many people feel they were ceremonial paths, processional ways, routes that the living were meant to walk, perhaps carrying the dead, perhaps walking in some rite whose steps are entirely lost. A row may have been a line drawn between this world and the next, a path for a soul or a path for mourners, a way of saying with stone and with distance that this ground and this direction mattered. But that is a feeling, a reasonable and gentle guess, and it is not knowledge. The rows do not point reliably at the rising of any star or at the solstice sun in any way that has ever been firmly proved. They simply run, low and patient, across the empty moor, from somewhere to somewhere, and the people who would have understood the journey, who knew which way to face and what to carry, and what words to say while walking the line of stones, have been gone for thousands of years and took the meaning with them. There is a particular stillness to the Dartmoor rows that is worth carrying down into sleep. A great stone circle gathers you in. A long barrow holds the dead in a chamber. But a stone row is a line, an invitation to move, a sentence written across the land that can only be read by walking it. And the moor is so wide and so quiet and so often wrapped in mist that to come upon a row of low grey stones leading off into the fog is to feel, very strongly, that you have found a path and that the path was made with care, by people who knew exactly where it went, and that if you followed it far enough through the heather, you would arrive somewhere they thought was important. And you would, in a sense. You would arrive at a grave, at the quiet cairn at the end of the line. But the meaning of the walk, the why of the long patient row of stones, stays out on the moor in the mist, with everything else the ancient British knew and we do not. Before we let the moor fade, there is a final long line worth thinking of. A line not of small stones, but of turf and stone walls flung right across the waste of the island, because the British landscape carries more than one of these great drawn boundaries, and the lesser known of them is, in its quiet way, the more haunting. Most people who think of a Roman wall in Britain think of Hadrian's Wall, the famous stone barrier in the north of England, and that wall deserves its fame. But the Romans, having built it, then pushed further north and built a second wall, beyond the first, across the narrow neck of what is now central Scotland, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. It is called the Antonine Wall, after the emperor in whose reign it was raised, and it was meant to be the new edge of the Roman world, the true and final frontier, the line beyond which lay the country the Romans never tamed. The Antonine Wall was not, for the most part, a wall of stone. It was built largely of turf, cut into blocks and stacked on a stone foundation. A great green rampart with a deep ditch dug in front of it, and a road running along behind, and a chain of forts spaced along its length where the soldiers lived. It ran for some 60 kilometres from sea to sea, and an immense amount of disciplined labour went into it. The cutting of the turf, the digging of the ditch, the building of the forts, the carving of the handsome stone slabs that recorded which legion had built, which stretch and how many paces of it they had completed. It was a serious thing, a real frontier, the considered northern limit of the largest empire the ancient Western world had known. And then, after only about 20 years, the Romans abandoned it. They simply walked away from the Antonine Wall, pulled back, and returned to holding the older line of Hadrian's Wall to the south. And the turf rampart that had been meant to be the permanent edge of the world was left to soften and slump and green, over and become, across the centuries, a low grassy ridge running through what are now the back gardens and parks and golf courses of central Scotland. The reasons for the withdrawal are argued over: trouble elsewhere in the empire, the difficulty of holding grounds so far north, the simple judgment that the land beyond was not worth the cost of keeping it. But the feeling the abandoned wall leaves behind is larger than the administrative reasons. Here was the most powerful state of its age, drawing a line and saying, "This far and no further, this is the edge," and here, only 20 years later, quietly admitting that the line could not be held, and stepping back. The Antonine Wall is a monument to a limit, and to the discovery that the limit was in the wrong place, and the country it had been built to shut out, the country of the people the Romans called by various names and never conquered, remained beyond it in the mist, unbeaten, going about a life that Rome never managed to write down. It is a fitting last thought for this long walk, because so much of what we have touched tonight sits on the far side of some wall like that, beyond a line we cannot cross. Not a wall of turf, but a wall of time, and of silence, and of the simple fact that the people who knew are gone. We can stand on our side of it, in the lamplight, with our maps and our careful excavations, and our tree ring dates and our patient guesses, and we can see the shapes on the other side. The stones, the mounds, the rows, the carved drums, the antler frontlets, the great green ramparts, the drowned land under the sea. We can see them clearly. We just cannot get across to ask what they meant. And there is no shame in that, and no real sorrow in it either, only a kind of wonder, because every one of those shapes is a sign that people were here, long before us, thinking and building and burying and believing, with as much intelligence and as much feeling as we have, and that they left these things deliberately, and that the things have waited patiently, in the chalk and the peat and the turf and the cold northern water, for us to come and stand in front of them in the dark. And now the night is growing deep, and we have walked a very long way, and it is time to let the journey come gently to rest. Think of the ground we have crossed. We began on a wide chalk plain, with the great stones of Stonehenge standing in the dark, and we could not say why they were raised, or why their builders carried the smaller stones 150 miles from the hills of Wales, or why one pale stone at their heart seems to have travelled the whole length of the island from the far north. We walked to Avebury, the largest stone circle in the world, with a village asleep inside it, and to Silbury Hill, the greatest mound in ancient Europe, raised at a colossal cost of labour to cover, as far as anyone has ever found, nothing at all. We went north to the cold green islands of Orkney, to the snug stone rooms of Skara Brae unburied by a storm, to the great chamber of Maeshowe, built to catch the light of the midwinter sun, to the Ness of Brodgar that was used for 1,000 years and then closed with one enormous final feast. We stood on the lonely ridge of Callanish, where the stones seemed to wait for the low moon, once in a generation, to come skimming along the body of the sleeping hills. We looked at the white horse on the Uffington hillside, 3,000 years old and alive, only because 100 unbroken generations of people, none of whom knew why, kept climbing the hill to scour it clean. We looked at the giant on the Dorset hill and the long man on the Sussex slope, and could not say how old they truly are, or who they were meant to be. We stood on a Norfolk beach where the sea had uncovered a ring of timber around an upturned tree, and at a fenland river where a Bronze Age village had burned and fallen and kept its last meal in the pot for 3,000 years, and at the mouths of the deep flint mines where people crawled into the dark to bring up the good stone. We met the ancient dead themselves, the dark-skinned hunter in the Cheddar Cave, the archer from the Alps buried in his wealth near Stonehenge, the vanished farmers and the incoming beaker people, and the great silent turnings of the population of the island. We met Lindo Man, kept whole by the bog, killed with a terrible and careful violence that can only have been a rite. We saw the beautiful things that were given to the rivers, the shields and the swords and the horned helmet, and the cape of pure gold folded around a nameless body in Wales. We followed the Romans in and watched them write their birthday invitations and their requests for warm socks on slips of wood at Vindolanda. And we watched the Ninth Legion march off into a silence from which it never clearly returned, and we turned the little bronze dodecahedron over in our hands and could not name it. And then we watched the whole bright Roman world in Britain fall back, within a few generations, into a darkness so complete that people forgot what the towns had been. We met the Picts, who carved like angels and left a language of symbols that no one can read, and a spoken tongue that survives only as a scatter of place names. We stood over the empty ship at Sutton Hoo. The king dissolved entirely into the sand, and on the cliff at Tintagel, where the legend of Arthur and the real lost kings of the West stand side by side and never quite meet. We looked out over the cold grey water at the drowned country of Doggerland, a whole homeland and thousands of years of lives gone under the sea. We knelt over the carved chalk drums laid beside dead children and traced the cup and ring marks holding the rain on the open moor, and listened to the folk tale that grew up to fill the emptied meaning of the rollright stones, and put on, in our minds, the antler headdress of a hunter 11,000 years ago, and the thread that runs through all of it, the thing that ties Stonehenge to Skara Brae, to Lindo Man, to the White Horse, to the drowned land, is not really a thread of fact, it is a thread of silence. Again and again tonight we have come up to the edge of something built or carved or buried with enormous care, enormous skill, enormous meaning, and again we have found that the meaning itself is gone, that the people who knew it took it with them, that what reaches us is the beautiful and patient object and never the reason. It would be easy to feel that as a sadness, and there is sadness in it, but there is something else in it too, and it may be the gentlest thought to carry down into sleep. All of those people, across all of those thousands of years, the stone draggers and the mound builders and the hunters in their deer skulls and the women writing to their friends on the cold frontier, all of them lived lives that were, to them, completely real and completely full, lives that mattered enormously, every bit as much as your life matters to you tonight. They loved people. They worried about things. They built and they buried their dead with care, and they looked up at the same moon that is over your roof right now, the same midwinter sun, the same slow-wheeling stars. The mystery is not that they are far away. The mystery is how close they are, how the island is simply full of them, just under the turf, just under the water, the whole soft green country resting on layer upon layer of people who were here before, who will never be explained, and who do not, in the end, need to be explained in order to be honored and remembered and let to rest. So there is nothing left to solve tonight. There never was. The stones will stand on the plain, whether or not we understand them, and the white horse will gleam on its hill, and the drowned country will sleep under its sea, and all of it will keep gently until another night. Let the questions go now. Let them settle, the way dust settles in an old chamber when the door is finally closed. You do not have to carry them. They have waited 4,000 years and longer, and they are very good at waiting, and they will still be there, patient and quiet and unhurried, long after you have woken and risen and walked back out into your own day. Let your breathing be slow and easy. Let the warmth of where you are lying hold you. Let the long old island with all its sleepers hold you too. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. The night is deep, and it is kind, and it is yours. Rest now. Sleep well. Good night.